heard my beautiful, devout fiancée tell her parents that the moment the wedding was over, she would bleed my accounts dry and leave me. I stood in the dark, listening to the woman I loved call me a pathetic, trusting loser. I did not scream. I did not confront her. I walked out into the light, smiled for the cameras, kissed her cheek, and decided right then that my final wedding gift to her would be a federal arrest warrant. The smell of damp wool coats and stale cedar is burned into my memory. It was supposed to be the happiest night of my life. My name is Harrison Cole. I am 35 years old, and I have spent the last 10 years working as a senior financial compliance officer. My entire career is built on catching fraud. I hunt down discrepancies. I find the lies hidden in spreadsheets. Yet I completely missed the massive fraud standing right in front of me in a white lace dress. We were at the St. Jude Church Fellowship Hall. It was our engagement party. The room outside was filled with over 100 guests eating catered salmon and toasting to our future. I had stepped into the dark coat room to find the keys to my car because Chloe said she left her lipstick in the glove box. Before I could turn the light on, the heavy oak door pushed open. I stepped back into the shadows of the winter coats. Chloe walked in. My beautiful, sweet Chloe, the woman who prayed with me every Sunday. But she was not alone. Her parents, Richard and Barbara Sterling, followed her inside. Richard closed the door behind them. I was about to step forward and announce myself to make a joke about hiding in the dark when Chloe spoke. Her voice was not the soft, gentle tone she used with me. It was sharp. It was cold. It was dripping with a kind of venom I had never heard before. "I can barely stand his cheap suits, Mom," Chloe snapped. "Did you see what he wore tonight? It looks like he bought it off a clearance rack." I froze. My hand gripped the fabric of a winter coat. My suit was not cheap, but it was not the $5,000 bespoke tailoring her father wore. I was a practical man. I saved my money. I built a future. I thought that was what she loved about me. Barbara let out a harsh, condescending laugh. "Just breathe, darling. You only have to tolerate his lack of taste for a little while longer. The wedding is only a few weeks away." I know, Chloe sighed, sounding utterly exhausted by my existence. "But playing the devoted church girl is exhausting. He is so utterly boring. But once the wedding is over, and his name is on the joint trust, I will bleed him dry and walk away. He is too much of a trusting, naive loser to ever see it coming." My heart stopped beating. The air in the coat room suddenly felt too thick to breathe. A trusting, naive loser. That was how the woman I was about to marry saw me. I had spent 3 years treating this woman like a queen. I had bought her a ring that cost me 6 months of my salary. I had paid off her student loans because she cried about being overwhelmed by debt. I did it because I loved her. I did it because I believed we were building a life together under God. Richard chuckled, a deep, arrogant sound that made my blood run cold. "Do not feel bad for the boy, Chloe. He is just a stepping stone, a necessary sacrifice to fix our liquidity problem. My offshore accounts are completely tied up and the creditors are sniffing around the country club. We need his liquid assets in that joint trust immediately. Once the funds are secured and transferred out, you can file for divorce. We will leave him with nothing but a broken heart and an empty bank account." "Exactly," Barbara agreed. "He is a compliance officer, for heaven's sake. He makes a decent salary, but he lives like a peasant. He has hundreds of thousands just sitting in low-yield index funds. It is practically a crime to let that money go to waste. We are doing him a favor by taking it. It will teach him a lesson about the real world." I stood perfectly still in the darkness. My mind raced back through the last 3 years. Every sweet smile, every late-night conversation about our future children. Every time she insisted we open joint accounts early to show our commitment to each other. It was all a calculated performance, a long con. And I was the mark. I felt a physical pain in my chest, like a blade twisting between my ribs. The urge to step out of the shadows, to scream at them, to tear the engagement ring off her finger was overwhelming. But then my professional instincts kicked in. I am a compliance officer. When you catch a thief in the act, you do not warn them. You gather evidence. You trace the money. You build an airtight case so that when the hammer falls, they cannot escape. If I confronted them now, it would be my word against theirs. They would deny it. They would spin it. They would find a way to make me look like a paranoid, controlling monster in front of our entire church community. Worse, I had already granted Chloe limited access to some of my accounts to pay for the wedding vendors. If I caused a scene now, they might drain whatever they could reach before I could freeze it. I needed to know exactly how deep their theft went before I tipped my hand. The door opened again. The light from the fellowship hall spilled into the room, blinding me for a second. Chloe, Richard, and Barbara stepped back out into the party, their faces instantly transforming back into masks of warmth and religious piety. I waited 2 full minutes in the dark. I forced my breathing to slow down. I wiped my face. I adjusted my tie. I locked my emotions in a vault deep inside my mind. When I pushed the coat room door open and walked back into the hall, the noise of the party hit me like a wave. Friends from church patted my shoulder. My coworkers raised their glasses to me, and then I saw her. Chloe was standing near the cake laughing at something the pastor said. She looked beautiful. She looked innocent. She turned, saw me, and her face lit up with a radiant smile. "There you are, Harrison," she said, walking toward me and wrapping her arms around my neck. "Did you find my lipstick?" "No," I replied, my voice perfectly steady. I could not find it in the dark. "I guess we will just have to make do." I leaned in and kissed her cheek. I smiled for the photographer who suddenly flashed a camera in our faces. I posed with Richard and Barbara, shaking Richard's hand and thanking him for hosting such a wonderful evening. I played the role of the happy, oblivious groom perfectly. But behind my smile, my blood was ice. I was no longer a fiancé, I was an investigator, and they were my targets. They. The rest of the night was an agonizing blur of fake laughter and forced conversation. Every time Chloe touched my arm, my skin crawled. Every time Richard called me son, I wanted to hit him. But I held my composure. I waited until the final guest left, until I dropped Chloe off at her luxury apartment, kissing her goodnight one last time. The drive back to my modest duplex felt like a journey through a different reality. The rain started to fall, hitting the windshield in heavy, rhythmic drops. The rhythmic sound was the only thing keeping me grounded. When I finally parked and unlocked my front door, the silence of my home was deafening. I did not take off my suit. I did not turn on the main lights. I went straight to my home office, sat at my desk, and opened my laptop. The emotional shock was wearing off, replaced by a cold, hyper-focused adrenaline. I logged into my primary banking portal. I had always kept my finances strictly organized. I had a checking account for daily expenses, a savings account for emergencies, and an investment portfolio that held my life savings. Chloe and I had recently opened a joint checking account to handle the wedding expenses. I had deposited $20,000 into it just last week to cover the caterer and the florist. I opened the joint account ledger. The $20,000 was gone. It had not gone to the caterer. It had not gone to the florist. It had been transferred out 2 days ago to an external account I did not recognize. I felt a cold sweat break out on the back of my neck. I clicked on the transaction details. The transfer was authorized by Chloe. The destination account was listed under a corporate LLC name I had never heard of before. Sterling Holdings, Richard Company. But that was just the beginning. I moved to my personal savings account. The account Chloe was not supposed to have any access to yet. The account where I kept the bulk of my liquid cash meant for our future down payment on a family home. I stared at the screen. The numbers did not make sense. I refreshed the page. The numbers stayed the same. There was a pending wire transfer. $45,000. My hands started to shake. I clicked on the wire details. It was initiated late yesterday afternoon. The authorization signature matched mine, but I had never signed it. The funds were being routed to a different external account. This one was offshore. The routing number belonged to a bank in the Cayman Islands. They were not waiting for the wedding. They were already bleeding me dry. I sat back in my chair, the blue light of the computer screen casting long shadows against the walls. The sheer audacity of it was staggering. Richard Sterling had forged my signature to authorize a massive wire transfer from my personal savings to an offshore account to cover his hidden debts. Chloe had drained the wedding fund. They were stripping me of everything I had worked for over the past 10 years, piece by piece, right under my nose. A normal man would have called the police right then. A normal man would have driven to Chloe's apartment and demanded his money back. But I knew how these people operated. If I stopped the wire transfer now, they would claim it was a bank error. They would say it was a misunderstanding about wedding budgets. They would cover their tracks, cancel the wedding, and I would never be able to prove criminal intent. They would walk away clean, and I would be left looking like a paranoid fool. I could not let them walk away. I wanted them to burn. I leaned forward and began taking screenshots of every transaction. I downloaded the wire transfer authorization form. I analyzed the digital footprint of the login sessions. The IP address that initiated the wire transfer was not from my house. It traced back to the IP address of Richard Sterling Real Estate Office. I started building a digital dossier right there at my desk. I pulled up the state registry for Sterling Holdings, LLC. I found the incorporation documents. I started tracing the web of shell companies Richard was using to hide his insolvency. For the next 6 hours, I did not move from my chair. I used every compliance tool, every forensic accounting trick I had learned in my 10-year career. By the time the sun started to rise, painting the sky a pale, bruised purple, I had uncovered a massive, sprawling mess of financial desperation. The Sterlings were completely broke. Their country club membership, their luxury cars, Chloe expensive apartment. It was all funded by a house of cards built on high-interest loans and tax evasion. They were millions of dollars in debt. I was truly nothing more than a fresh injection of cash to keep their sinking ship afloat for a few more months. I closed my laptop. My eyes burned from staring at the screen. My heart was a cold, heavy stone in my chest. The woman I loved was a phantom. She did not exist. The family I thought I was joining was a criminal enterprise. They thought I was a trusting, naive loser. They thought my cheap suits meant I was weak. They mistook my kindness for stupidity. They had no idea who they were dealing with. I picked up my phone. I did not call the bank to cancel the wire transfer. I let the $45,000 go. It was the hardest thing I have ever done, watching my hard-earned money slip away to a Cayman Islands account. But I knew it was necessary. That $45,000 was the bait. It was the undeniable proof of federal wire fraud. I set the phone down. I took a deep breath. The wedding was 3 weeks away. 3 weeks to play the role of the happy, oblivious groom. 3 weeks to let them dig their graves so deep they would never see sunlight again. I would give them exactly what they wanted. I would sign their papers. I would smile for their friends. I would walk down that aisle and say I do. And then I would destroy them. The morning sun hit the kitchen counter with a harsh brightness that made my eyes ache. I had not slept a single minute. I sat on the cheap wooden stool in my duplex holding a mug of black coffee that had gone cold hours ago. My mind was a relentless machine running risk assessments and legal variables. For 10 years, I had audited major corporations. I had flagged embezzlement rings. I had sent arrogant executives to federal prison for masking their assets. Yet the most dangerous financial fraud I had ever encountered was currently walking up my front steps. I heard the familiar jingle of her keys in the lock. The door swung open and Chloe stepped inside. She brought with her the crisp winter air and the scent of her expensive floral perfume. She was holding a pink pastry box from the high-end bakery downtown and a thick manila folder tucked under her arm. She wore a soft white cashmere sweater and a bright, loving smile. If I had not stood in that dark coat room the night before, I would have looked at her and felt like the luckiest man in the world. Instead, I looked at her and saw a predator. "Good morning, sweetheart," she said, her voice dripping with artificial honey. She walked over and kissed me gently on the cheek. I forced myself to smile back. I forced my muscles to relax. I played the role of the devoted, grateful fiancé because my survival depended on it. "I brought you those almond croissants you love," she continued, setting the bakery box on the granite island. And Todd dropped off the final escrow paperwork for the house. He said, "The sellers are getting anxious. We really need these signed by noon to lock in the interest rate and keep the closing on track." She slid the heavy manila folder across the counter toward me. The house she was referring to was a magnificent $1.2 million estate her parents had magically found for us just 2 weeks ago. Richard and Barbara had insisted it was the perfect place to raise a family and establish our new life. They had framed it as a blessing. Now I knew it was nothing but the next phase of the heist. "Oh, great," I said, keeping my tone light and cheerful. "I will get it done right now. Do you want me to make you a fresh cup of coffee while I read it over?" "You are the best," she replied, kissing my forehead. "I am actually going to jump in the shower real quick. I need to meet the florist at 10. Do not worry about reading all the boring legal jargon, Harrison. Todd already highlighted all the sticky tabs where you need to sign. Just follow the yellow flags." She turned and walked down the hallway toward the master bathroom. I waited until I heard the shower water running. The moment the water hit the tiles, my entire demeanor changed. My smile vanished. My jaw clenched. I pulled the manila folder toward me and opened it. I did not skip to the yellow sticky tabs. My professional background in financial compliance immediately took over. I know how contracts are structured. I know how thieves hide poison pills in the middle of dense, boring text. I started flipping through the pages, my eyes scanning the paragraphs with the speed and precision of a trained auditor. The first 10 pages were standard real estate disclosures, property lines, liability waivers, standard home inspection clauses. But Todd Sterling was a sleazy real estate broker who drove a leased sports car and thought he was the smartest man in every room. Todd thought he was dealing with a naive paper pusher. He made the mistake of underestimating my specific set of skills. I found the trap on page 17. It was buried under a misleading section titled Contingent Marital Asset Management. To a normal home buyer, it would look like standard language about how the property would be titled after the wedding, but the actual text was a sweeping and aggressive durable power of attorney. I read the exact phrasing twice to make sure I was not hallucinating. It stated that by signing this document, I was granting Chloe Elizabeth Sterling total unconditional legal authority to manage my entire financial portfolio. It explicitly gave her the right to open lines of credit, in my name, liquidate my individual retirement accounts, and authorize wire transfers from any account bearing my Social Security number without my physical presence or verbal confirmation. My breath caught in my throat. I stared at the paper. The sheer audacity of the legal trap was breathtaking. They were not just trying to take the house. They were setting up the legal framework to strip me of every single dollar I had saved since I was 22 years old. Todd had slipped this clause into the middle of a massive escrow packet, hoping my love for his sister would blind me to the fine print. They wanted me to hand over the keys to my entire financial existence before we even stood at the altar. The room felt like it was closing in on me. A wave of suffocating panic hit my chest. My first instinct was violent and immediate. I wanted to tear the document into shreds. I wanted to march into the bathroom, rip the shower curtain open, and throw the pieces in her face. I wanted to scream that I knew everything. I wanted to call the police and have them all arrested for attempted fraud. But my analytical mind slammed the brakes on my anger. I realized the reality of my situation. I was completely cornered. If I confronted Chloe right now, the entire operation would scatter like roaches in the light. They would instantly play the victim. Chloe would cry and say Todd must have made a clerical error with the paperwork. Richard would claim the $45,000 he wired to the Cayman Islands the night before was just a non-refundable deposit for the luxury honeymoon he was supposedly booking for us. Financial crimes require the burden of undeniable intent. If I stopped the wedding today, the local authorities would look at this as a messy civil dispute between a couple going through a bad breakup. The police would tell me to hire a lawyer to fight for the $45,000 in small claims court. I would spend years paying legal fees, fighting Richard Sterling high-priced defense attorneys, and I would likely never see a single dime of my money again. They would walk away clean, and they would do this to someone else. To get my money back and protect myself legally, I had to play their game. I had to let them believe their trap was working flawlessly. I needed to gather federal-level evidence. I needed an undeniable paper trail of a coordinated criminal conspiracy to commit wire fraud. I had to sign the paper. I picked up the blue ink pen resting on my counter. My hand hovered over the signature line on page 17. If I signed this properly, I was giving Chloe the loaded gun she intended to use on me. I needed a decoy. I needed a way to give them the document they wanted while quietly rendering the power of attorney legally void in a way Todd would never notice. As a compliance officer, I knew exactly how administrative law worked in our state. A durable power of attorney buried inside a real estate contract requires a specific, separate, notarized acknowledgement to be active. Todd had included the notary block at the bottom of the page, assuming the closing agent would stamp the entire packet at once. But I also knew that if the signatory intentionally omits the secondary initials next to the specific liability clause, the power of attorney becomes legally severable and invalid upon review by any competent banking institution. I took a steadying breath. I signed my full name on the primary line at the bottom of the page, but I deliberately skipped the two small initial boxes hidden in the margin next to the worst paragraphs. I also used a slightly altered version of my signature one I specifically kept on file at my primary bank for disputed fraud claims. It looked identical to the naked eye, but a banking machine would flag it as a mismatch. I signed the rest of the yellow sticky tabs throughout the document. I closed the thick manila folder and tapped it neatly against the granite counter. I had just handed them a useless piece of paper that they believed was their golden ticket. The trap was set, but I was the one holding the trigger. The water in the bathroom shut off. A few minutes later, Chloe walked into the kitchen wrapped in a thick white towel, her wet hair smelling like expensive coconut shampoo. She looked at the folder sitting on the counter. All done, she asked, her eyes darting toward the documents with a hungry anticipation she tried to hide behind a sweet smile. All done? I replied warmly. I signed everywhere Todd told me to. You can drop it off at his office on your way to the florist. I cannot wait for this house to finally be ours. Thank you, sweetheart, she beamed. She walked over and hugged me tightly. You are always taking such good care of us. I promise I'm going to make you the happiest man in the world. She grabbed the folder and her purse gave me one last loving look and hurried out the front door. I stood alone in the kitchen, feeling a strange mixture of triumph and absolute disgust. I had successfully navigated the first landmine, but the war was only just beginning. I barely had time to process what had just happened before a loud, aggressive knock rattled my front door. It was not a polite knock. It was a demand for entry. I walked over and pulled the door open. Barbara Sterling stood on my welcome mat. She was wearing a tailored designer trench coat and holding a leather handbag that cost more than my first car. She looked past me into my home, her eyes narrowing with open disdain. She wiped her expensive leather boots aggressively on the mat, as if my porch was covered in toxic waste. "Good morning, Harrison," she said smoothly, though her tone lacked any actual warmth. "I know I am early for our wedding planning dinner tonight, but I was in your charming little neighborhood looking at some charity project sites and decided to drop by. May I come in?" "Of course, Barbara," I said, stepping aside. "Please make yourself at home." She walked into my living room and stopped dead in the center of the floor. She looked at my simple gray sofa. She looked at the modest television stand I had built myself. She looked at the lack of crown molding on the walls. Her expression was a masterclass in quiet judgment. She did not yell. She did not need to. Her silence communicated everything I needed to know about my worth in her eyes. "It is amazing how you manage to live in such a compact space," she said, running a manicured finger along the back of an armchair. "It builds character, I suppose. It must be so difficult for you to understand the kind of aesthetic standard Chloe is used to." I closed the front door and walked into the living room, keeping my hands resting casually in my pockets. It is a humble place, I agreed, but it has always served me well. I save my money for the things that really matter. Barbara let out a sharp, patronizing laugh. Well, saving money is cute, Harrison, but preserving a legacy requires capital. Richard and I were just talking last night about how much work it is going to take to elevate you to our level. Chloe is used to the country club. She is used to first-class accommodations. We just pray your little compliance salary can maintain the lifestyle she deserves. You really are incredibly lucky that our family is willing to pull you up out of this mediocrity. Her words were designed to shrink me. They were designed to remind me that I was a peasant marrying into royalty, and that I should be grateful for the privilege of being their stepping stone. In the past, her comments would have made me feel small. I would have tripped over my words apologizing and promising to work harder to impress them. But I was no longer the trusting loser they thought I was. I knew the truth. I knew her designer trench coat was bought on credit. I knew the country club she bragged about was threatening to revoke their membership due to unpaid dues. I knew her family was financially drowning, and I was the only thing standing between them and total ruin. I looked Barbara directly in the eyes. I did not flinch. I did not look away. I let a slow, polite smile spread across my face. "You are absolutely right, Barbara," I said, my voice steady and calm. "I have a lot to learn from the Sterling family. I am looking forward to getting exactly what I deserve from this marriage." She smiled back, completely oblivious to the threat hidden inside my words. "Excellent," she said, adjusting her heavy handbag. "Now go put on a better suit. We are having dinner at the club tonight, and Richard wants to discuss the final seating arrangements. Try not to embarrass us." She turned and walked toward my kitchen to inspect my appliances. I stood in my modest living room watching the woman who was actively helping her daughter plot my financial execution. The silent bleed had begun. They thought they had secured my assets. They thought they had broken my dignity. But tonight at the country club, I was going to push them into making the fatal mistake that would send them all to federal prison. The heavy brass doors of the Oakmont Valley Country Club swung open, releasing a wave of warm air thick with the scent of roasted garlic, expensive leather, and old money. I handed the keys of my 6-year-old sedan to a valet who looked at it with thinly veiled pity before jogging away. For the past 3 years, walking into this building had always made me feel like an imposter. I used to nervously adjust my tie and worry about using the wrong fork. I used to genuinely believe I was stepping into a world of elite sophistication that I was barely lucky enough to visit. Tonight, I walked through those brass doors with the clinical detachment of a forensic auditor stepping into a crime scene. I knew the truth now. The crystal chandeliers hanging above me were practically bought on credit. The men in custom tuxedos laughing near the mahogany bar, and the women draped in diamonds were surrounded by an illusion. The Sterlings were holding court at their usual corner booth by the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the golf course. As I approached their table, I saw them perfectly framed in the warm golden lighting. Richard sat at the head of the table, swirling a glass of deep red wine, his posture screaming authority. Barbara was next to him, her posture rigid, her gaze darting around the room to ensure the right people were noticing them. Chloe sat across from her parents wearing a stunning silk dress that I now knew was purchased on one of the credit cards Todd had fraudulently opened in my name just hours prior. "There is my future husband, Chloe," announced, her voice hitting that perfect pitch of adoring fiancé. She stood up and kissed me on the cheek. Her perfume was intoxicating, but the touch of her skin against mine felt like a warning alarm. I smiled, pulling out her chair for her before taking my own seat. "Good evening, everyone. Sorry I am a few minutes late. Traffic on the interstate was backed up." Richard waved a dismissive hand, not bothering to look up from his menu. "Do not worry about it, Harrison. We went ahead and ordered the first round of appetizers and a bottle of the Reserve Cabernet. I assumed you would not mind. It is a bit out of your usual price range, but we are celebrating." "Of course," I said smoothly. "Please order whatever you like." I watched Richard call the sommelier over to pour the wine. He played the part of the wealthy patriarch flawlessly. But my mind was actively running the numbers from the digital dossier I had compiled the night before. I knew this country club was threatening to terminate his membership due to 90 days of unpaid dues. I knew his real estate brokerage was drowning in bridge loans. He was sitting across from me ordering wine that cost more than my first car, using the stolen equity of my life savings to fund the illusion of his success. The appetizers arrived delicate plates of seared scallops and artisan cheeses. The conversation flowed around me, mostly dominated by Barbara detailing the extravagant floral arrangements she had unilaterally upgraded for the wedding ceremony. I nodded along, eating quietly, playing the exact role they expected me to play. I was the silent, grateful peasant, too intimidated by their grandeur to speak up. Barbara took a delicate sip of her wine, set the crystal glass down, and turned her sharp, calculating eyes directly onto me. The subtle shift in her posture signaled the beginning of the attack. "Harrison, we need to have a very grounded conversation about the reality of your future with our daughter." Barbara began. Her voice was pitched just loud enough for the neighboring table of wealthy retirees to hear. "Chloe has been raised with a very specific standard of living. She is accustomed to a certain caliber of society, of travel, of comfort." I placed my fork down on the white linen tablecloth. "I understand that, Barbara. I am committed to providing for her." Barbara let out a soft, mocking laugh that cut through the ambient noise of the dining room. "Oh, I am sure you mean well. But let us be honest. Your background is incredibly modest. You grew up in a very different tax bracket, and this boring, low-tier desk job of yours, while stable, hardly generates the kind of wealth required to maintain the sterling name." She leaned forward, resting her diamond-ringed fingers on the table. "Chloe is used to a certain standard, Harrison. We just pray your little salary can maintain the lifestyle she deserves. You are lucky our family is elevating you. Without us, you would just be another anonymous face in a beige cubicle." The words were designed to humiliate me. They were crafted to strip away my dignity and remind me of my place at the bottom of their social ladder. Beside me, Chloe offered a small apologetic pout that was entirely fabricated. "Oh, Mom, do not be so harsh on him," she murmured. "Harrison is a hard worker. He tries his best." I looked at the woman I had promised to marry. She was validating her mother's insult while pretending to defend me. It was a masterful psychological game. In the past, this exact dynamic would have sent me into a spiral of anxiety. I would have felt the burning heat of shame crawling up my neck. I would have desperately promised them that I was up for a promotion, that I would work 80 hours a week to give Chloe the world. Tonight, the only thing I felt was a cold, calculating focus. I swallowed my pride. I let my shoulders slump forward just a fraction of an inch to feign defeat. I looked down at my plate, acting exactly like a man who had just been properly disciplined by his superiors. "You are right, Barbara," I said, keeping my voice quiet and submissive. "I know I am not from your world. I know my salary is nothing compared to what Richard brings in. I am just incredibly grateful that you are willing to guide me. I want to learn how to manage wealth the way you do." My display of total submission fed directly into Richard's massive ego. He puffed out his chest, leaning back against the leather booth with a satisfied smirk. He took another large swallow of his wine, clearly pleased that the boring compliance officer had surrendered without a fight. "It takes decades of strategy to build what we have," Harrison Richard declared, taking the bait perfectly. "It is not just about making money. It is about protecting it. It is about outsmarting the system. The government wants to take half of everything you build. You have to know how to maneuver." I slowly moved my right hand under the table. I slipped my smartphone out of my suit pocket. Using just my thumb, I bypassed the lock screen and opened the voice memo application. I pressed the red record button, leaving the phone resting silently on my thigh. The microphone pointed directly toward Richard. "I have always wondered about that," I said, keeping my eyes wide and innocent. As a compliance officer, I only see the boring regulatory side of things. I see the basic domestic accounts. But how do you handle the tax burden on a massive portfolio like yours, Richard? It must be incredibly complex to keep that kind of liquidity safe. Richard laughed, a booming sound that echoed off the high ceiling. It is an art form, my boy. You cannot keep real wealth in standard domestic banks. They regulate you to death. You have to move it offshore. You set up a holding company, register it in a jurisdiction with absolute privacy laws, and route the funds through a layered trust. I leaned forward, acting completely enthralled by his financial genius. That sounds brilliant, but is it not risky? How do you even set something like that up without raising red flags? Richard leaned in closer, dropping his voice to a conspiratorial whisper, thrilled to be showing off his intellect. You use the right fixers. I have a guy in the Cayman Islands, Bank of Avalon. You establish an entity. For example, I use a front called Apex Horizon Ventures. You wire the capital there under the guise of an international real estate consultation fee. Once it hits the Avalon accounts, it vanishes from the American tax radar. The routing numbers shift entirely. I sat there nodding slowly, committing every single word to memory while my phone recorded the audio in crystal clear high definition. He had just handed me the exact name of the shell company. Apex Horizon Ventures. He had just named the specific offshore bank, Bank of Avalon. He was openly admitting to federal tax evasion and international wire fraud in a crowded country club simply because his narcissism demanded an audience. That is incredible, I whispered, shaking my head in feigned absolute awe. I have so much to learn from you, Richard. I hope one day I can build that kind of security for Chloe. You stick with me, Harrison, Richard said, raising his glass to toast his own brilliance. I will teach you how the real game is played. The dinner continued for another agonizing hour. I sat quietly eating my meal, listening to Barbara complain about the incompetence of her country club staff and watching Chloe browse luxury vacation packages on her phone. I played the grateful, invisible son-in-law. But beneath the table, my phone continued to record every arrogant boast, every specific detail of their lavish spending, and every breadcrumb of financial evidence I needed to complete my federal dossier. When the dessert plates were finally cleared and the astronomical bill was charged to Richard's delinquent account, we all stood up to leave. We made our way through the crowded dining room and out onto the grand stone patio where the valet station was located. The night air was freezing, biting through the thin fabric of my suit. Richard and Barbara walked ahead toward the lobby to greet a local judge they knew, leaving Chloe and me standing near the stone pillars. Chloe shivered, wrapping her arms around herself. I am going to wait inside where it is warm, she said, kissing my cheek. I will call you when I get home, sweetheart. She turned and walked into the lobby. I stood alone on the patio, waiting for the valet to bring my car around. The tension in my chest was finally beginning to ease. I had the recording. I had the routing details. I had survived the dinner without breaking my cover. Then the heavy glass doors opened behind me, and Todd Sterling stepped out onto the patio. Todd was Chloe's older brother. He was a man who wore too much cologne, smiled with his teeth, but never his eyes, and treated every interaction like a hostile negotiation. He walked up beside me, lighting a thick cigar and blowing a cloud of harsh gray smoke into the freezing air. Cold night, he muttered, not looking at me. Very cold, I replied, keeping my posture relaxed. Todd took another drag of his cigar, the glowing orange ember illuminating his sharp, predatory features. Listen, Harrison, let us skip the small talk. I am handling the logistics for the wedding venue, the grand ballroom at the Biltmore Hotel. Chloe has her heart absolutely set on it. It is her dream venue. I nodded slowly. I know. She has talked about it for months. Right, Todd said, turning to finally look at me. Well, there is a minor logistical hiccup. The Biltmore requires a massive upfront security deposit to hold the date. Richard Capital is tied up in a major commercial acquisition this quarter. You know how real estate goes. Liquid cash can be tight when you are moving millions. I stared at him, my expression blank. I knew exactly where this was going. I need a bridge loan, Todd said, his voice lowering into a gravelly demand. $100,000. Brother to brother. just to secure the venue until Richard quarterly dividends clear next month. I will pay you back with interest before the wedding even happens. I looked at the valet stand, watching my modest sedan pull up to the curb. Todd, you know I do not keep that kind of liquid cash just sitting around in a checking account. My money is tied up in long-term index funds. Liquidating $100,000 right now would trigger massive capital gains taxes. Todd stepped closer to me. The smell of his cheap cologne mixed with the pungent cigar smoke made my stomach churn. He invaded my personal space, attempting to use his height and broad shoulders to physically intimidate me. Do not play poor with me, Harrison. Todd sneered, his mask of fake brotherhood instantly vanishing. We both know you have the capital. You just signed the power of attorney paperwork this morning. The escrow accounts are opening. You have the liquidity. He was pressing his foot on the gas pedal. They had already stolen $45,000. They had maxed out fraudulent credit cards. Now he was trying to bully me into handing over another $100,000 in clean, untraceable cash. I am sorry, Todd. I cannot authorize a withdrawal like that. It is simply not possible right now. Todd's jaw tightened. His eyes grew dark and dangerous. You listen to me very carefully, you boring little paper pusher. Chloe deserves the perfect wedding. Our family is giving you a seat at a table you could never afford on your own. If you refuse to step up and handle this minor expense, I am going to walk right back inside and tell my sister that her future husband is too cheap to give her the wedding of her dreams. I will tell her you are holding out on her. How do you think she is going to react to that? You think she is going to want to walk down the aisle with a man who will not even protect her happiness? The threat hung in the freezing air between us. He was leveraging my supposed love for his sister to extort me. He was threatening to blow up my relationship if I did not pay the ransom. It was a classic, brutal intimidation tactic. I looked at Todd. I looked at the burning ember of his cigar. I felt the phone resting heavily in my pocket, containing the voice recording that was going to destroy his entire existence. I let a look of absolute panic and defeat wash over my face. I broke eye contact, staring down at the stone patio like a man who had just been utterly broken. Okay, I whispered, letting my voice tremble perfectly. Okay, Todd. Do not tell Chloe, please. Let me look at my portfolios tomorrow. Let me see which funds I can liquidate without taking too much of a penalty. I will get you the money. Todd smirked. He took a step back, satisfied that he had successfully terrified the weak, compliant groom into submission. That is what I thought, Todd said, clapping a heavy hand onto my shoulder. You are finally learning how to be a sterling Harrison. I will email you the wiring instructions in the morning. Do not make me wait. He turned and walked back through the glass doors into the warmth of the country club, leaving me alone in the cold. I stood there for a long moment, listening to the engine of my car idling at the curb. The valet stood shivering, waiting for me to take the keys. I walked over, handed the young man a $20 bill, and slid into the driver's seat. I closed the door, sealing myself inside the quiet, dark cabin of my car. I put my hands on the steering wheel and gripped the leather until my knuckles turned white. I was not trembling from fear. I was shaking with the sheer overwhelming anticipation of what I was about to do. Todd wanted me to wire $100,000 to secure a venue. Instead, I was going to use those wiring instructions to give the FBI the final piece of the puzzle they needed to lock him in a federal cage. The morning sun brought no warmth, only a sterile, blinding light that reflected off the frost-covered windshield of my car. I dialed Todd number at exactly 8 in the morning. I knew he would be nursing a hangover from the country club, but I wanted to set the timeline on my terms. He answered on the 4th ring, his voice groggy and irritated. I kept my tone perfectly level, injecting just the right amount of rehearsed regret. Todd. I spent the entire night reviewing my portfolios. I spoke with my broker. I cannot bridge the $100,000. The early withdrawal penalties on my index funds would wipe out nearly a decade of compound interest. It is just not possible. There was a long, heavy silence on the line. I could hear him breathing, the gears of his predatory mind turning. When he finally spoke, the fake brotherhood was completely gone. His voice was a low, venomous hiss. "You are making a massive mistake, Harrison. My sister deserves a man who can provide, not a coward hiding behind financial penalties. Family steps up. You just proved you do not belong at our table." He hung up before I could reply. I lowered the phone, feeling a strange surge of adrenaline. I had officially cut off their easy cash supply. I knew the retaliation would be swift, but I severely underestimated how reckless they were willing to be. 72 hours later, I was sitting at my desk on the 14th floor of my compliance firm. My dual monitors were filled with quarterly risk assessments for a mid-sized logistics company. The office was quiet, humming with the low sound of central heating and the distant clatter of keyboards. Then my personal cell phone buzzed. It was a push notification from my credit monitoring service. A new hard inquiry had been recorded on my Equifax file. 30 seconds later, a second alert popped up. TransUnion, a minute after that, Experian. I set down my coffee mug and opened the application. 3 premium high-limit credit cards had just been approved in my name. The total unsecured credit line extended to me was roughly $85,000. Before I could even navigate to the fraud reporting tab, my email chimed with a welcome message from a major cryptocurrency exchange platform. An account had been established using my social security number. They were not wasting a single second. The forged power of attorney document I had signed earlier in the week was officially in play. Todd had taken the decoy contract to a corrupt notary, and his real estate network stamped it and immediately went to work weaponizing my identity. Over the next 4 hours, I watched my pristine credit score get absolutely slaughtered in real time. It was like watching a slow-motion car crash on a digital dashboard. First, a $30,000 charge hit the newly opened Platinum card. The merchant code belonged to the Biltmore Hotel Grand Ballroom. Chloe had bypassed my refusal to provide the cash by simply forcing my credit to absorb the security deposit for her dream wedding venue. Next, a $25,000 charge posted to a luxury travel concierge service. First-class flights to the Maldives, a private villa reservation, and an exclusive yacht charter. This was the honeymoon Richard had bragged about, the one they intended to enjoy right after handing me divorce papers. Finally, a series of rapid, fragmented transfers drained the remaining $30,000 in available credit directly into the new cryptocurrency exchange account. That was Todd. He was desperately trying to convert my credit into untraceable digital assets to cover the massive high-interest bridge loans drowning his brokerage firm. Their strategy was brilliant in its sheer cruelty. By maxing out massive lines of credit in my name, they were actively destroying my debt-to-income ratio. Within a week, my credit score would plummet. Any bank would flag me as a high-risk borrower. If I needed a loan, a mortgage, or any traditional financing, I would be denied. They were engineering a localized financial crisis to corner me. They wanted to force me to liquidate my untouchable premarital mutual funds and dump the cash directly into the joint checking account just to survive the wedding expenses and protect my reputation. Once the liquid cash was in the joint account, they could legally wire it offshore and leave me holding $85,000 in unsecured debt. I locked the door to my office. I closed the blinds. I pushed the corporate risk assessments to the side of my desk and brought up the proprietary financial tracking software I used for federal compliance audits. It was a highly restricted system designed to trace corporate embezzlement and shadow accounts across multiple digital borders. Using it for a personal matter was a massive gray area, but considering I was actively documenting a federal wire fraud conspiracy, I did not hesitate. I pulled the digital application logs from the 3 credit card approvals. I ran the metadata through the compliance mainframe, stripping away the basic routing layers to find the originating Internet Protocol addresses. The computer screen processed the data lines of code scrolling downward until the geographic locators locked in. The first 2 credit card applications, the ones used for the hotel and the honeymoon, originated from a high-speed residential network. I ran the latitude and longitude coordinates. The address matched a luxury apartment complex in the Arts District. It was Chloe Apartment. the crypto exchange account, and the subsequent $30,000 transfer traced back to a commercial fiber optic network downtown. It was the exact suite number of Todd Sterling Real Estate Brokerage. I leaned back in my ergonomic desk chair, staring at the glowing monitors. Seeing the hard data produced a fresh, sickening wave of betrayal. There was no ambiguity left. Chloe was not just passively going along with her family financial crimes. She was sitting on her expensive velvet sofa, typing my social security number into loan applications, actively participating in my destruction. She was stealing my future while planning her floral arrangements. I shifted into total operative mode. I began printing everything. Every IP address ping, every timestamp, every fraudulent transaction receipt. I captured the digital footprints linking the crypto transfers directly to Todd-registered devices. I printed the internal banking logs showing the authorization portal relying on the severable legally void power of attorney I had manipulated. I went to the supply closet down the hall, grabbed a thick black binder and a set of plastic dividers. I spent the rest of the afternoon meticulously organizing the evidence. Tab 1 contained the offshore wire transfer from my savings account. Tab 2 contained the fraudulent credit applications from Chloe apartment. Tab 3 contained Todd cryptocurrency laundering scheme. By 5 o'clock, I held a physical dossier of undeniable interconnected financial crimes. Every single page in that binder represented a federal felony. Combined, they carried a mandatory minimum sentence of 20 years in a federal penitentiary. I placed the heavy black binder into my leather briefcase and locked it. I walked out of the office building, blending perfectly into the crowd of tired commuters heading to the train station. I looked like just another corporate employee going home for the weekend. No one passing me on the street had any idea I was carrying the absolute destruction of a high society family in my right hand. The weekend arrived with a bitter freezing wind that stripped the last leaves from the oak trees lining the streets. Sunday morning meant church. For 3 years, Sunday service at St. Jude Church had been the cornerstone of my relationship with Chloe. She had always insisted on sitting in the third row, right where the pastor and the wealthiest members of the congregation could see our devotion. I walked into the sanctuary wearing a dark navy suit. Chloe met me in the vestibule looking absolutely radiant in a modest knee-length floral dress and a cream-colored cardigan. She threw her arms around me, burying her face in my shoulder. "I missed you this week," she whispered, her voice a perfect simulation of love. "Wedding planning has been so stressful without you. I cannot wait until we are finally married and all of this chaos is behind us." I wrapped my arms around her waist, matching her performance flawlessly. "I know, sweetheart. I am counting down the days. We are going to have a beautiful life." We walked down the aisle holding hands. We took our seats in the third row. The stained glass windows cast colorful streams of light across the wooden pews. The organ music swelled, filling the massive stone sanctuary with a sense of overwhelming peace. The pastor stepped up to the wooden pulpit and delivered a passionate 30-minute sermon about the sanctity of marital unity, about protecting your spouse, and about building a foundation on absolute truth. Chloe held my hand the entire time. During the closing prayer, she rested her head on my shoulder, her thumb gently tracing the back of my hand. She was the picture of a devout, loving bride. To the rest of the congregation, we were the perfect couple. To me, she was a predator sitting in the house of God, wearing the skin of a saint. After the service, she linked her arm through mine. "Come back to my place for lunch," she said brightly. "Mom sent over some of that chicken salad you love. We can relax and just spend the afternoon together. No wedding talk, I promise." I drove us to her luxury apartment in the Arts District, the very same apartment where she had defrauded me for $55,000 just days prior. The space was immaculate, filled with expensive modern art, plush white rugs, and floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city skyline. She went into the kitchen, humming softly to herself as she prepared 2 plates of food. I sat on the velvet sofa, keeping my posture relaxed, waiting for the other shoe to drop. Criminals like the Sterlings never invited you over just to relax. Every interaction was a calculated move on a chessboard. Chloe walked out of the kitchen. She did not bring the plates of food. Instead, she was carrying a thick, professionally bound stack of legal documents. Her bright, cheerful smile was replaced by a look of manufactured guilt and soft hesitation. She sat down next to me on the sofa, placing the heavy document onto the glass coffee table between us. She let out a long, heavy sigh, reaching over to gently squeeze my knee. "Harrison." She started, her voice dropping into a soft, vulnerable register. "I am so embarrassed to even bring this up. I told my dad I did not want to do this. I told him we trust each other perfectly. But you know how Richard is. He is so old school and protective about the family business assets." I looked at the document resting on the glass table. I did not need to read the title page to know what it was. The trap was advancing to the final stage. "What is it, Chloe?" I asked, keeping my voice perfectly calm and supportive. She looked down at her lap, playing with her engagement ring. "It is a prenuptial agreement. My dad had his corporate lawyers draft it up. He is refusing to release the trust funds for our new house unless we both sign it. He says it is just standard procedure for anyone marrying into the Sterling family. I fought him on it, Harrison. I really did. But he threatened to pull his financial support for the wedding entirely if we do not get this notarized today." I stared at the thick stack of paper. The sheer predatory nature of her lie was staggering. Richard was not protecting family assets. He had none left to protect. They were using a prenup to legally lock in the theft they had already committed and to guarantee their absolute control over the rest of my wealth once the divorce papers were filed. I reached out and placed my hand over hers, offering a warm, reassuring squeeze. "Hey," I said softly, "do not stress about it. I understand where your father is coming from. He just wants to protect his little girl. If signing this makes him feel comfortable, I have no problem looking it over." Chloe's eyes lit up with profound relief. "You are so amazing, Harrison. I knew you would understand. You really are the best man I have ever known." She leaned in and kissed me. I kissed her back, feeling the cold, hard reality of the document sitting on the table. Todd and Richard had tried to break my credit. Chloe had tried to break my bank accounts. Now they were bringing in their lawyers to finish the job. I pulled the prenuptial agreement toward me. I cracked open the heavy cover, knowing that whatever poison they had written inside this contract was going to be the exact weapon I used to burn their entire empire to the ground. The illusion of safety shattered completely 3 weeks before the wedding. It was a Tuesday afternoon when Chloe called my office, her voice light and musical, asking me to meet her for a quick lunch at a high-end bistro downtown. She said she wanted a break from looking at floral arrangements. I walked into the restaurant expecting to share a quiet meal with my future wife. Instead, I found myself walking directly into a legal firing squad. Sitting in the circular leather booth next to Chloe was a man I recognized immediately. Gregory Thorne was the Sterling family corporate attorney. He was a man who wore custom Italian suits and possessed the cold, dead eyes of a shark. He did not handle minor family squabbles. He handled aggressive corporate acquisitions and hostile takeovers. The fact that he was sitting next to my fiancée holding a thick leather-bound portfolio meant they were ready to drop the hammer. I slid into the booth across from them. I kept my face perfectly neutral, masking the massive surge of adrenaline rushing through my veins. "Hello, Harrison," Gregory said smoothly. His voice was deep and entirely devoid of warmth. "I hope you do not mind me crashing your lunch date. Richard asked me to bring over some final administrative paperwork for you and Chloe to finalize." I looked at Chloe. She gave me a soft, apologetic smile, reaching across the table to gently touch my hand. "I am so sorry to spring this on you, sweetheart," she murmured, playing the role of the innocent daughter flawlessly. "Daddy just insisted. You know how protective he is about the family name and our estate planning. It is just some boring standard protocol." Gregory unclasped his leather portfolio and slid a 50-page legal document across the polished mahogany table. The title page was printed in bold black ink. Premarital Asset Protection and Dissolution Agreement. It was a prenuptial agreement. "We are getting married in 21 days, I said, allowing my voice to tremble slightly. I let my shoulders drop, projecting the image of a man who had just been deeply wounded by a sudden lack of trust. We already signed the escrow papers for the house. You have access to the joint trust. Why are we doing this now? Gregory smiled, a thin, tight expression that offered no comfort. Do not take it personally, Harrison. Men in your particular tax bracket sometimes get overwhelmed when they marry into a family of our caliber. Richard simply needs absolute assurance that Chloe will not have her lifestyle compromised if you fail to meet the expectations of this marriage. I picked up the document and turned to the summary pages. My professional training as a compliance officer allowed me to scan the dense legal jargon with terrifying speed. What I saw was not a standard prenuptial agreement. It was a predatory contract designed to strip me of my basic human rights. The contract mandated that all assets placed into our joint trust would automatically default to Chloe in the event of a divorce. They had already pressured me into moving the majority of my liquid life savings into that exact trust, but the most vicious part of the document was buried on page 34. It was an extremely aggressive infidelity clause. I read the paragraph twice to ensure I was fully grasping their cruelty. The clause stated that if I committed adultery, or if there was even substantial circumstantial evidence of inappropriate conduct, I would forfeit any right to contest the divorce. I would lose the house. I would lose the joint trust. I would be left with absolutely nothing while assuming full liability for any debts accrued during the marriage. This is an infidelity clause, I said, looking up at Chloe with perfectly simulated heartbreak. Do you really think I would ever betray you? Do you think so little of me? Chloe looked down at her lap, squeezing her eyes shut to produce a single fake tear. Oh, Harrison, please do not look at me like that. I know you would never cheat on me. It is just a formality. My father is forcing us to do this because of what happened to his business partner last year. If you love me, you will sign it. It just proves you have nothing to hide. Gregory tapped his expensive gold pen against the table. I suggest you review it tonight, Harrison. Take it to a cheap strip mall lawyer if you feel the need. But Richard made it explicitly clear. The wedding does not happen and the house purchase falls through if this contract is not executed by tomorrow morning. They had timed this perfectly. They waited until the invitations were mailed, until the deposits were paid, until the social pressure of a canceled wedding would be catastrophic. They thought they had cornered a weak, trusting fool. I will read it tonight, I whispered, staring at the table like a defeated man. I will give you my answer tomorrow. I took the document, paid for their lunch, and walked out into the cold afternoon air. I did not go back to my office. I drove straight to the industrial outskirts of the city, pulling into the gravel parking lot of a crumbling brick building. The man waiting for me inside was Samuel Keaton. Samuel was a former federal prosecutor who had left the government after refusing to bow to political pressure. He now operated quietly in the private sector, specializing in dismantling hostile corporate structures. He was brilliant, ruthless, and he owed me a massive favor from a compliance case years ago. I dropped the prenuptial agreement onto his metal desk. I told him everything. I explained the stolen wire transfer. I explained the fraudulent credit cards Todd had opened, and I pointed to the infidelity clause waiting on page 34. Samuel poured 2 cups of black coffee, sat down, and read the contract. For 10 minutes, the only sound in the room was the ticking of his wall clock and the rustling of paper. Then a slow, dark smile spread across his face. They think they are dealing with a lamb, Samuel rasped, tossing the document back onto the desk. But Gregory Thorne made a fatal mistake. He is arrogant. He copy and pasted this infidelity and forfeiture structure from a corporate asset dissolution template he uses for his elite clients in a completely different jurisdiction. I leaned forward, my pulse quickening. What does that mean for me? It means he ignored our specific state statutes regarding premarital asset conversion. Samuel explained, his eyes locking onto mine. In this state, an absolute forfeiture clause applied to a joint trust is only ironclad if the assets were deposited after the marriage certificate is signed, but your money is already in the trust. The legal mechanism Thorne is trying to use to steal your money is fundamentally flawed. If you sign this, it is legally binding, yes. But it is binding under conditions we can entirely manipulate. I stared at the contract. I had spent the last decade auditing financial systems. I knew how to move money legally and quietly. A plan began to form in my mind, perfectly aligning with Samuel's legal strategy. I do not want to just invalidate their contract, I said, my voice turning to steel. I want to let them believe they won. I want them to trigger their own trap. If they want my life savings, I want to make sure they get exactly what they deserve. Samuel nodded slowly, understanding the depth of my strategy. We restructure your wealth before you sign their prenup. We set up an irrevocable blind trust. We move every single dollar of your actual net worth, your retirement funds, your pure liquid cash, into that blind trust today. We date the inception 48 hours prior to this prenuptial agreement. I finished his thought. Which means the blind trust completely predates the marriage. It becomes an untouchable entity. The prenuptial agreement cannot access it, the divorce courts cannot touch it, and Chloe can never claim a single penny of it. Exactly, Samuel grinned. But we leave the joint trust open. We leave the $45,000 they already stole, and we attach the fraudulent credit debt Todd created to that specific joint entity. When Chloe inevitably pulls the trigger on this infidelity clause and claims the joint trust, she will not be taking your wealth. She will be legally assuming full liability for a toxic asset loaded with federal fraud evidence and maxed out credit cards. She will be legally stealing her own family debts. The brilliance of the countermove sent a rush of pure adrenaline through my chest. They were trying to bleed me dry. Instead, I was going to hand them a financial grenade and let them pull the pin. Draft the blind trust, I told Samuel, standing up from the chair. Move the money immediately. I am going to sign their devil contract tomorrow. The next morning, I walked into the lobby of Richard Sterling's massive real estate firm. The walls were lined with marble and expensive modern art. It was a monument to their fake wealth. I was escorted into a massive glass conference room. Chloe was sitting next to her father. Gregory Thorne was waiting at the head of the long table, his gold pen resting next to the signature pages. They all looked at me with varying expressions of predatory anticipation. Chloe gave me a sad, hopeful look. Richard just stared at me with cold impatience. I walked to the table. I kept my shoulders slumped. I made sure to look like a man who had not slept, a man who was completely broken by the reality of his situation. I looked at Chloe, letting my voice crack perfectly. I read it, I said softly. I do not like it. It makes me feel like you do not believe in us. But I love you, Chloe. I want to spend the rest of my life with you. If signing this is the only way your family will accept me, then I will do it. Chloe leaped up from her chair and wrapped her arms around my neck. Oh, Harrison, she cried, burying her face in my shoulder. Thank you. Thank you so much. This changes nothing between us. I promise. I hugged her back, feeling absolutely nothing but cold resolve. I sat down in the leather chair. Gregory pushed the document toward me and handed me the pen. A wise decision, Harrison Richard rumbled from across the table. You are finally acting like a man who understands how the real world works. Welcome to the family. I clicked the pen. I signed my name on the dotted line. I initialed every single page. I signed the infidelity clause. I legally bound myself to their predatory terms. I handed the document back to Gregory. He snatched it up with a look of immense satisfaction, snapping his leather portfolio shut. They thought they had won. They thought they had successfully placed a collar around my neck. They had absolutely no idea that my real wealth was already gone, safely locked away in a blind trust they could never reach. They had just legally claimed ownership of their own criminal enterprise. I walked out of the corporate building with Chloe holding my hand, chatting excitedly about the cake tasting we had scheduled for the afternoon. I nodded and smiled, playing the perfect puppet. But as I drove us away from the city center, a dark realization settled over me. I knew how greedy the Sterlings were. I knew how desperate Richard was for liquid cash to pay his creditors. A normal gold digger would marry me, wait a year, and then manufacture a reason to divorce me. but the Sterlings did not have a year. They did not even have a month to get everything they wanted to trigger the forfeiture of the joint trust and steal what they thought was my life savings. Chloe needed me to violate the prenuptial agreement immediately. She needed me to break the infidelity clause before the ink on our marriage certificate was even dry. I looked at the beautiful woman sitting in my passenger seat. I knew right then that she was going to frame me. She was going to set a trap to destroy my reputation and trigger the contract. The only question was how far she was willing to go to destroy me. The wedding was rapidly approaching. The final collision was inevitable. I just needed to survive whatever nightmare she was planning to unleash on me next. I kept my hands steady on the steering wheel, driving straight into the storm. If they wanted a betrayal, they were going to get one, just not the one they were expecting. The annual Regional Financial Regulatory Summit always took place at the Grand Meridian Hotel downtown. It was a mandatory 3-day event filled with endless keynote speeches about shifting tax codes, international banking laws, and corporate risk management. In any other year, I would have dreaded the tedious schedule and the recycled catered food. But right now, the conference was the perfect excuse to spend 10 hours a day away from Chloe. Before I left the apartment that morning, she had kissed me deeply, straightening my tie and telling me to have a wonderful time networking. Her smile was practically glowing with supportive affection. It should have been my first warning. Predators always look the most relaxed when they know the trap has already been set and the bait has been taken. By 6 in the evening, my brain was completely fried from the back-to-back seminars. I walked down to the hotel lobby lounge, a sprawling open room with dim ambient lighting, heavy mahogany paneling, and overpriced craft cocktails. I took a seat at a small corner table facing the massive wooden bar, placed my leather briefcase on the floor, and ordered a sparkling water with a twist of lime. I needed a clear head. I was secretly reviewing the final draft of the blind trust Samuel Keaton had established for me, ensuring every single dollar of my actual wealth was safely locked away from the Sterling family reach. That was when she sat down. She did not ask if the seat was available. She just slid into the plush velvet chair directly across from me. She was striking, wearing a fitted crimson dress that was entirely out of place for a conservative financial convention populated by accountants and lawyers. Her perfume was heavy, overwhelmingly sweet, and clearly engineered to leave a lingering scent on anything she touched. "Hello there," she purred, leaning forward so deliberately that her intentions could not have been more obvious. "A handsome guy like you looks way too stressed to be sitting alone at a hotel bar. Let me buy you a real drink and help you relax." I looked up from my phone. I have spent my entire career analyzing human behavior during high-stakes audits, searching for the micro-expressions that reveal a lie or a hidden agenda. The woman sitting across from me was acting. Her smile was completely disconnected from her eyes. Her posture was tense, forced, and entirely unnatural. She was performing a rehearsed role. I politely declined, keeping my voice even. "Thank you, but I am just finishing some work. I am getting married very soon, so I will have to pass." She did not take the hint. Instead, she stood up, picked up her large glass of red wine, and moved around the small circular table to sit right beside me on the leather bench. She invaded my personal space instantly. She pressed her thigh against mine and reached out, grabbing the lapel of my suit jacket with fingers that felt like claws. "Getting married does not mean you cannot have a little fun first," she whispered, trailing her manicured nails down the fabric of my chest. "I promise I can keep a secret if you can." My peripheral vision caught a sudden, unnatural movement. About 40 feet away, sitting in a dimly lit booth near the main lobby entrance, a man wearing a dark baseball cap was holding a professional camera with a telephoto lens. The lens was pointed directly at our table. He was not snapping random photos of the hotel architecture. He was focused entirely on me, his finger hovering over the shutter, waiting for the perfect, incriminating shot. The entire scheme crystallized in my mind in a fraction of a second. Chloe and Todd needed me to violate the strict infidelity clause of the prenuptial agreement I had just signed the day before. They needed documented proof of my betrayal to execute their hostile takeover of the joint trust and strip me of everything. They could not wait for me to actually cheat because they knew my character. So they manufactured a scandal. They hired a woman to throw herself at me in a highly public place, and they hired a photographer to capture the exact split second it looked like I was reciprocating. If that glass of red wine spilled on my shirt, if her bright lipstick smeared on my collar, they would have all the circumstantial evidence they needed to destroy my career, ruin my reputation in our church, and legally steal my savings. I did not panic. I did not shove her away because any sudden physical struggle would look like a passionate embrace on a still photograph. I simply stood up, executing a smooth and calculated motion, sliding completely out of her reach. I took 2 large steps backward, placing myself entirely in the open center aisle, where the camera could only capture the massive physical distance between us. I spoke loudly, my voice carrying clearly over the low hum of the lounge music. "I do not know who you are, but you need to back away from me immediately. Do not touch me again." Several heads turned in our direction. Fellow compliance officers and corporate attorneys looked over, their attention drawn by my firm, unwavering tone. The woman's face flushed with sudden panic. She had expected a flustered, quiet rejection that she could manipulate into a messy, tactile encounter. She did not expect a public clinical boundary setting that drew an audience of witnesses. I turned on my heel and walked directly to the mahogany bar. I bypassed the bartender and signaled for the lounge manager, a tall man in a tailored suit who recognized me from my corporate firm account. "That woman in the crimson dress just aggressively harassed me," I told the manager, projecting absolute professional outrage. "She is not a registered guest of this financial conference, and I believe she is running a targeted scam. I want hotel security here right now, and I want her legally trespassed from this property immediately." The manager signaled his staff without hesitation. Within 60 seconds, 2 broad-shouldered security guards converged on the corner table. The woman tried to argue, her voice rising in defensive panic, but the hotel staff gave her no room to maneuver. They escorted her out of the lounge through the side exit, completely ruining the photo opportunity and forcing the photographer in the corner to quickly pack up his gear and flee. But I was not finished. I knew I needed to link this botched hit job directly back to the Sterling family. I could not just walk away with suspicions. I needed hard, undeniable proof. I pulled the manager aside. "I need a massive favor," I said, keeping my tone serious and urgent. "I handle regulatory risk management for my firm. I believe that woman was hired to execute a corporate espionage framing tactic against me. I need to see the lobby security footage from the last 2 hours. It is an absolute emergency regarding my personal safety." Because my firm spent hundreds of thousands of dollars hosting events at this hotel every year, the manager did not argue. He led me through a pair of double doors and down a narrow concrete hallway into the security control room. A massive wall of glowing monitors displayed every angle of the hotel property. We pulled up the high-definition footage of the main lobby entrance, rewinding the timeline. I watched the screen intensely. We went back 30 minutes, then 45, then a full hour. There it was. On the crisp digital feed, Todd Sterling walked through the revolving glass doors. He was wearing his usual flashy designer jacket, looking around nervously. He stood near the valet waiting area, constantly checking his phone. 5 minutes later, the woman in the crimson dress approached him. The security camera captured the entire interaction with devastating clarity. Todd spoke to her for a few moments, handed her a thick white envelope that clearly contained cash pointed directly toward the lounge area where I was sitting, and then quickly left the building. I felt a cold, hard knot form in the pit of my stomach. The evidence was absolute. My future brother-in-law had physically paid a stranger to stage a sexual assault against me just to trigger a predatory legal contract. "I need a digital copy of that specific time frame," I told the manager, my voice dropping to a low, dangerous register. "Export it to a flash drive. Right now." The manager complied, understanding the gravity of what we had just watched on the screen. 10 minutes later, I walked out of the security room with the encrypted video file safely tucked into my inside jacket pocket. I bypassed the rest of the conference seminars entirely, walked out into the frigid evening air, and headed straight for the parking garage. The concrete walls of the parking structure were gray, cold, and hollow. I found my modest sedan parked on the 4th level. I unlocked the doors, got inside, and shut the world out. The engine remained off. The silence inside the cabin was absolute, broken only by the sound of my own ragged breathing. The pure, clinical adrenaline that had kept me focused and hyper-aware for the past hour suddenly evaporated. It left behind a massive, crushing void that threatened to swallow me whole. I gripped the top of the steering wheel until my hands ached. I leaned my forehead against the cold leather. I tried to breathe evenly, but my chest felt like it was wrapped in heavy iron bands. I thought about the very first time I met Chloe at the church charity drive. I thought about how her eyes had sparkled with apparent kindness when I nervously asked her out for coffee. I thought about the quiet evenings we spent cooking dinner in her kitchen, talking about the names we would give our future children. I had loved her with every fiber of my being. I had wanted nothing more than to protect her, to provide for her, to build a safe sanctuary for us against the harshness of the outside world. And it was all a meticulously manufactured illusion. Every single kiss was a financial transaction. Every tender word was a cold calculation. She did not just want to leave me, she wanted to annihilate my character. She wanted to frame me as a cheating, horrible man so she could steal my life savings and ruin my professional reputation without shedding a single genuine tear of guilt. She had sent her brother to hire a woman to destroy me, probably while she sat in her expensive apartment picking out the final hymns for our wedding ceremony. The sheer psychopathic cruelty of her betrayal was too immense to process all at once. My hands began to shake violently. My vision blurred as the profound grief finally broke through the analytical walls I had built to protect myself. A single tear slipped down my face. It burned against my cold skin. It held 3 years of lost hope, 3 years of wasted devotion, and the absolute death of the man I used to be. I let it fall. I let myself feel the pure agonizing pain of a broken heart for exactly 1 minute. Then I reached up and wiped my face. I stared at my reflection in the rearview mirror. The man looking back at me was no longer a grieving fiancé. The vulnerability was completely gone. The trusting, naive compliance officer was dead and buried. What remained was a cold, impenetrable shell of absolute resolve. They wanted a war of attrition. They wanted to see who could bleed the other dry first. They had chosen the wrong victim. I would not shed another tear for Chloe Sterling. I would not feel another ounce of pity for her bankrupt, arrogant family. I was going to smile for the cameras. I was going to stand at that beautiful altar. I was going to let them put the golden rings on our fingers, and then I was going to drop a legal anvil on their entire universe. The profound silence of the car was suddenly shattered by the buzzing of my cell phone resting on the passenger seat. The screen illuminated the dark cabin. It was an encrypted number. I picked it up and swiped the screen to answer. Harrison, the voice on the other end, said. It was Agent Miller, the federal investigator I had contacted through my secure compliance network channels days earlier. I had sent him the heavy physical dossier containing the offshore wire transfers, the forged power of attorney documents, and the fraudulent credit card applications. I am here, I replied, my voice steady, flat, and hard as stone. Steady, flat. I have my forensic team reviewing the binder you provided, Miller said. You did our job for us. The paper trail is completely flawless. We traced Richard Shell Company in the Cayman Islands and we mapped out Todd cryptocurrency laundering scheme step by step. The prenuptial fraud is just the absolute icing on the cake. We have enough for felony wire fraud, aggravated identity theft, and criminal conspiracy. I looked at the digital clock glowing on my dashboard. The wedding was exactly 7 days away. 1 week until the jaws of the trap snapped shut for good. We are ready to move. Miller continued, the authority in his voice cutting clearly through the digital static. Just give us the signal. Where do you want us to execute the arrest warrants? I stared out the windshield into the dark, empty concrete garage. I pictured the lavish country club they had booked. I pictured the hundreds of wealthy guests, the towering, expensive wedding cake, and the arrogant, triumphant smiles of the family that had tried to bury me alive. Let them put on their finest clothes, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. Let them cut the cake. I will give you the signal at the reception." The private dining room at the elite downtown steakhouse was suffocating. It was the night before the wedding. 150 guests packed into the space. The air was thick with the smell of seared ribeye, expensive bourbon, and the heavy floral centerpieces Barbara Sterling had demanded. Everywhere I looked, I saw the false empire of the Sterling family on full display. They had rented out the entire top floor. They were spending money they did not have using credit they had stolen from me, all to impress people who would forget them the moment their bank accounts ran dry. I sat next to Chloe at the head table. She wore a stunning white cocktail dress. She spent the entire evening holding my hand, leaning her head against my shoulder, and playing the role of the hopelessly devoted bride. Her performance was terrifyingly flawless. If I had not heard her courtroom confession, if I had not spent the last 3 weeks tracking her digital fingerprints across fraudulent loan applications, I would have looked at her and felt like the luckiest man on earth. Instead, every time her skin brushed against mine, it took every ounce of my willpower not to pull away. The tension in my chest was a physical weight. I had spent the last 20 days living a double life. I had smiled through cake tastings. I had nodded politely through meetings with the florist. I had signed a prenuptial agreement designed to strip me of my human dignity. I had done all of it while secretly building a federal indictment that was currently sitting in the hands of the FBI. Tonight was the final hurdle. Tomorrow the trap would spring. But right now I had to survive the rehearsal dinner. Todd walked past our table, holding a glass of scotch. He gave me a wide, predatory grin and clapped a heavy hand on my shoulder. He squeezed just a little too hard. "Big day tomorrow," Harrison Todd said, his voice loud enough for the surrounding tables to hear. "I hope you are ready to officially join the big leagues. We are going to put you to work." I smiled back at him, forcing my facial muscles to convey absolute gratitude. "I am ready for whatever the family needs, Todd. I appreciate everything you have done to make this weekend happen." Todd chuckled, a dark, knowing sound. "Oh, you have no idea how hard I have been working behind the scenes. Just make sure you do not pass out at the altar tomorrow. We have a lot of money tied up in this little party." He walked away, mingling with a group of local politicians Richard had invited to bolster his image. I knew exactly what Todd meant by his hard work behind the scenes. He was actively trying to launder the credit he had stolen in my name. He thought he was taunting a clueless victim. He thought he was untouchable. Barbara drifted over a few minutes later. She carried a flute of champagne and looked down her nose at the small cluster of my friends sitting at a table near the back. I did not have a large family, just a few close colleagues from the compliance firm and some old college buddies. They looked incredibly out of place among the country club elite. "It is so sweet that your little friends could make it," Harrison Barbara said, her voice dripping with condescension. I was worried they might feel uncomfortable in a venue like this. I made sure the waiters gave them extra bread baskets so they would not go hungry. "They are having a wonderful time, Barbara," I replied evenly. "Thank you for being so accommodating." She sighed, adjusting her diamond necklace. "Well, tomorrow is about merging two worlds. It is going to take some time to polish your edges, but we are committed to the process. Just try to keep your friends from hovering around the open bar too much. We do not want any embarrassing incidents when the photographer is circulating." I nodded submissively. "Of course, I will make sure everyone is on their best behavior." Barbara walked away, satisfied that she had successfully reminded me of my inferior status. I picked up my glass of water and took a slow sip. The sheer arrogance of these people was astounding. They were completely bankrupt. They were swimming in toxic debt. Yet they still clung to this pathetic illusion of superiority, treating me like a stray dog they had generously allowed into their home. The dull roar of conversation suddenly quieted. The clinking of silverware against fine china stopped. At the center of the head table, Richard Sterling stood up. He held a crystal glass of champagne in his right hand. He tapped his silver knife against the rim. The sharp, high-pitched sound echoed through the massive dining room. Everyone turned their attention to the patriarch of the Sterling family. Richard smoothed the lapels of his custom suit and smiled warmly at the crowd. The lighting caught the silver in his hair, making him look distinguished, powerful, and completely in control. Friends, family, esteemed colleagues. Richard began, his voice projecting effortlessly across the room. Thank you all for gathering here tonight to celebrate the union of my beautiful daughter Chloe and her groom Harrison. A polite round of applause filled the room. Chloe beamed, looking up at her father with manufactured adoration. I kept my face frozen in an expression of polite anticipation. When Chloe was a little girl, Richard continued pacing slowly behind the table. I always told her that she was destined for greatness. The Sterling name carries a certain weight in this city. It carries a legacy of ambition, of corporate success, of relentless forward momentum. We are builders. We are leaders. And naturally, as a father, I always envisioned the kind of man my daughter would choose to stand by her side. Richard paused, letting the silence stretch. He looked directly at me. His smile did not reach his eyes. We always hoped Chloe would marry a titan of industry, Richard said. His voice was smooth, but the words were a public execution. We envisioned a young man who had already conquered the business world, a man who understood the complex machinery of high finance and elite commerce. Instead, she brought home Harrison. A few uncomfortable chuckles rippled through the crowd of his wealthy friends. My colleagues from the compliance firm shifted awkwardly in their seats. Harrison is a man of modest ambitions, Richard said, letting the word modest hang in the air like a dirty rag. He is a compliance officer. He works a quiet, safe, predictable job. He is not a shark. He is not a titan. And I will admit, when Chloe first told me she wanted to marry him, I was concerned. I wondered if a man so accustomed to living in the background could ever step up and carry the heavy mantle of the Sterling family. Richard took a slow sip of his champagne, relishing the absolute power he held in this room. He was publicly castrating my pride, establishing his dominance in front of 150 witnesses. But Chloe assured me that Harrison has a good heart. Richard said, his tone dripping with fake magnanimity. She told me he is loyal. And more importantly, she told me he is willing to learn. And that is what this family does best. We take potential, no matter how small or unrefined, and we build it into something spectacular. Harrison may have come to us as a man of simple means, but we will mold him into a Sterling. We will teach him how the real world operates. We will elevate him. Richard raised his glass high into the air. So let us raise our glasses to my beautiful daughter, and to the quiet, trusting young man she has chosen to take under her wing. To Chloe and Harrison, may tomorrow be the beginning of a very educational journey. To Chloe and Harrison, the crowd echoed. The toast was over. It was the most brutal, humiliating speech I had ever endured. Richard had just told a room full of people that I was a pathetic, unambitious loser who was entirely dependent on his family charity. He had stripped me of my manhood and painted himself as a benevolent king adopting a peasant. Chloe turned to me, her eyes shining with fake tears. "That was so beautiful," she whispered, squeezing my hand. "He really loves you, Harrison." I did not break character. I did not glare at Richard. I did not throw my napkin on the table or storm out of the room. Instead, I picked up my own glass of champagne. I stood up from my chair, turned to Richard, and smiled the brightest, most genuine smile I had shown all night. "Thank you, Richard," I said, my voice carrying clearly over the gentle applause. "I appreciate your honesty. I promise you by this time tomorrow I will show this entire family exactly what kind of man I really am. I'm looking forward to giving you everything you deserve." I raised my glass toward him. Richard smirked, entirely oblivious to the double meaning of my words. He nodded, accepting my apparent submission. I clinked my glass against Chloe's glass. I took a sip of the champagne. The cold liquid slid down my throat, matching the absolute ice in my veins. I sat back down. The conversation in the room slowly resumed its normal volume. The waiters began bringing out the main courses. I picked up my fork, but before I could take a single bite of my food, a sharp, distinct vibration pulsed against my right thigh. My cell phone was in my suit pocket. I had set a specific custom vibration pattern for one single contact, Agent Miller, the federal investigator handling my case. I kept my posture relaxed. I casually reached into my pocket under the cover of the white tablecloth and pulled out my phone. I kept it low shielded from Chloe view. I pressed my thumb against the screen to unlock it. There was a single encrypted text message from Miller. The message contained exactly 2 sentences. "The target funds have moved. The trap is closed." I stared at the glowing letters on the screen. My heart hammered against my ribs, sending a massive jolt of electricity through my entire body. I knew exactly what that message meant. For the past 3 days, I had been waiting for Richard and Todd to make their final fatal error. They had already stolen $45,000 from my savings. They had already opened fraudulent credit cards. But those were relatively small sums compared to their actual financial desperation. The real prize was the $1.2 million house fund. That fund was supposed to be the escrow account for the massive estate Chloe and I were allegedly purchasing. Richard had demanded I transfer the bulk of my liquid wealth into that joint account just to prove my commitment. But thanks to the blind trust Samuel Keaton had set up for me, the money sitting in that joint account was not actually mine. It was a highly leveraged line of credit secured entirely against the fraudulent assets Todd had created. It was toxic money dressed up to look like my life savings. Richard and Todd could not wait until after the wedding to touch it. Their creditors were closing in. They needed the cash immediately to save their sinking real estate brokerage. Miller message confirmed that Todd and Richard had just used the forged power of attorney to initiate a massive unauthorized wire transfer. They had drained the entire $1.2 million house fund, routing it directly into their unregulated offshore shell company in the Cayman Islands. They thought they had just secured their financial salvation. They thought they had successfully bled the naive compliance officer dry. What they had actually done was cross the threshold from a messy domestic dispute into a multi-million-dollar international federal crime. By moving that amount of money across international borders using forged documents and stolen identities, they had triggered a mandatory federal response. The crime was now officially a federal felony. There were no loopholes left. There were no civil court settlements that could save them. The FBI had the digital fingerprints. They had the IP addresses. They had the routing numbers. The crime was complete. The evidence was locked in the federal database. I locked my phone and slipped it back into my pocket. I looked across the table at Richard. He was laughing at a joke one of the politicians had told, tearing into his expensive steak, looking completely invincible. I looked at Todd, who was ordering another round of top-shelf bourbon on my stolen credit card. I looked at Chloe, who was gently resting her hand on my knee, playing the devoted wife. They were all smiling. They were all celebrating my destruction. They had absolutely no idea that they were already dead. They were walking corpses in designer clothes. The federal indictments were already being printed. The arrest warrants were already signed by a federal judge. I picked up my fork and ate my dinner. The steak tasted like ash, but I chewed and swallowed mechanically. I spent the next 3 hours participating in their charade. I shook hands with their arrogant friends. I listened to more condescending advice about how to manage my non-existent wealth. I kissed Chloe goodnight under the grand awning of the restaurant, promising her that tomorrow would be the most memorable day of our lives. I drove home through the quiet, dark streets of the city. The winter wind howled against the windows of my car, but inside I felt nothing but a profound, unshakable calm. The anxiety was gone. The grief over losing the woman I loved had completely burned away, leaving behind a pure, terrifying clarity. I parked in the driveway of my modest duplex. I walked inside, turning off the alarm system. I did not turn on the television. I did not pour myself a drink. I walked directly into my bedroom, took off my cheap suit, and neatly folded it over the back of a chair. I lay down in my bed and stared at the dark ceiling. The water stain, shaped like Texas, was barely visible in the moonlight. This small, humble house was the only real thing left in my life. It was the only thing the Sterlings had not managed to poison. Tomorrow was my wedding day. Tomorrow I would stand in front of God, my friends, and the people who tried to destroy me. I closed my eyes and let the silence of the room wash over me. I went to sleep knowing that when the sun came up, the entire Sterling Empire would burn to the ground and I would be the one holding the match. The heavy oak doors of the sanctuary stood closed, keeping the winter chill outside and sealing the intense, humid warmth inside. St. Jude Church was a masterpiece of Gothic architecture, but this morning it felt like a beautifully decorated terrarium. The air was thick and heavy, saturated with the overwhelmingly sweet scent of thousands of imported white lilies. Barbara Sterling had insisted on covering every available surface with the flowers. They cascaded down the wooden pews wrapped around the marble columns and framed the altar in a massive, ostentatious arch of pure white petals. I stood at the center of the altar, looking out over the sea of blooms, knowing with absolute certainty that every single flower had been purchased using the fraudulent credit lines Todd had opened in my name. I folded my hands in front of me, resting them lightly against the tailored fabric of my dark navy suit. The massive pipe organ positioned in the balcony above began to play a low, resonant chord. The deep vibration traveled down through the ancient stone walls, moving through the polished hardwood floor and thrumming directly against the soles of my shoes. It was a physical sensation that mirrored the relentless pounding rhythm of my own heart. The sanctuary was packed. Every pew was filled with the elite members of the local high society. Wealthy real estate developers, local politicians, and country club board members sat shoulder to shoulder murmuring quietly while flipping through the gold-embossed wedding programs. In the front row, Barbara sat with her posture completely rigid, her neck draped in a heavy diamond necklace. She looked incredibly proud, projecting the image of a victorious matriarch who had successfully orchestrated the social event of the season. A few feet away from her sat Todd. My future brother-in-law wore a custom-tailored tuxedo and a smug, arrogant grin. He adjusted his expensive cufflinks and leaned back against the wooden pew, looking completely at ease. He thought he was untouchable. He thought his offshore wire transfers and crypto laundering schemes were untraceable. He had no idea he was sitting in a room entirely surrounded by the invisible tightening snare of federal jurisdiction. The organ music suddenly shifted, rising into a grand, triumphant crescendo. The congregation stood up in perfect unison. The heavy oak doors at the back of the long center aisle slowly pushed open. The midday sunlight spilled into the dim sanctuary, creating a blinding halo of pure white light. And then she stepped through the doorway. Chloe walked into the church, her hand resting delicately on the arm of her father. She wore a breathtaking silk gown overlaid with intricate vintage lace. A long sheer veil trailed behind her, catching the sunlight and making her look completely ethereal. Her makeup was flawless, her hair styled in soft, elegant waves. As she began her slow, measured walk down the aisle, a collective gasp of admiration rippled through the gathered guests. Women smiled with tears in their eyes. Men nodded in silent respect. She looked like a vision of absolute purity and devotion. She looked like an angel descending to earth. I watched her approach, keeping my expression perfectly still. My face was a mask of awe and love, but behind my eyes, the cold, clinical reality of my situation dominated every thought. The contrast between her stunning angelic exterior and the absolute decaying rot of her soul was staggering. I remembered the dark coat room. I remembered the cold, venomous tone of her voice when she called me a cheap, trusting loser. I remembered the digital banking logs showing her quietly draining the wedding fund while kissing my cheek and telling me she loved me. She was not an angel. She was a financial assassin dressed in white silk. She was a predator walking down the aisle to secure her next meal. Every step she took toward me was another calculated move to secure her access to my life savings. She was smiling at the guests, projecting modesty and grace while her mind was undoubtedly focused on the offshore Cayman Islands account where her father had hidden my stolen money. Richard walked beside her, puffing his chest out with supreme arrogance. He caught my eye as they reached the halfway point of the aisle. He gave me a sharp, dominant nod, a silent reminder of the humiliating toast he had delivered at the rehearsal dinner the night before. He still believed I was the weak, compliant paper pusher he had molded into submission. He still believed I was nothing more than a convenient liquidity solution for his bankrupt, failing empire. When they finally reached the steps of the altar, Richard turned to his daughter. He lifted her veil, kissed her gently on the cheek, and placed her soft hand directly into mine. Her skin was warm. Her grip was firm and reassuring. "Take good care of my little girl, Harrison," Richard murmured, his voice projecting just loud enough for the first few rows of guests to hear his fatherly devotion. "I will give her exactly the life she deserves." "Richard," I replied, my voice steady and clear. Richard patted my shoulder completely, missing the razor-sharp edge hidden beneath my polite response. He stepped back and took his seat next to Barbara. Chloe stepped up to stand beside me. We turned together to face the pastor. The ceremony began. The pastor opened his leather-bound Bible, his voice echoing warmly through the microphone. He spoke beautifully about the sanctity of the marital bond. He talked about how a strong marriage must be built on a foundation of absolute transparency, mutual respect, and unwavering truth. He looked at us with genuine affection, believing he was witnessing the union of two devoted, faithful people. The sheer monumental hypocrisy of the moment was almost too heavy to bear. Every word about truth and honesty felt like a dark, twisted joke. Chloe stood beside me, listening to the sermon with her hands folded, demurely nodding in agreement with the pastor's words. She was an Oscar-winning actress delivering the performance of a lifetime. My mind completely detached from the religious sentiment of the ceremony. I began to view the entire proceeding through the rigid, unforgiving lens of federal law. This was not a wedding. This was the finalization of a criminal contract. To prosecute the Sterlings for their specific brand of financial manipulation, the federal government needed more than just forged signatures and offshore wire transfers. The Sterlings had structured their theft around the prenuptial agreement and the conversion of marital assets. They were operating under the assumption that the shield of family law and divorce court would protect them from criminal liability. They thought they could dismiss the stolen funds as a messy civil dispute over shared property. But they had made a fatal miscalculation. By standing here today, by formally entering into a legal marriage with the premeditated intent to defraud me, they were elevating their actions into a completely different stratosphere of criminal law. This ceremony was the final requirement to prove an organized conspiracy to commit spousal fraud. The marriage certificate we were about to sign was not a symbol of our love. It was Exhibit A. "It is now time for the exchange of vows," the pastor announced, smiling at Chloe. "You may begin whenever you are ready." Chloe turned to face me. She reached out and took both of my hands in hers. She looked up into my eyes, and for a fleeting second I almost believed her performance. Her eyes were wide, shining with unshed tears. Her voice trembled perfectly, carrying just the right amount of overwhelming emotion. "Harrison?" She began, her voice echoing softly through the silent sanctuary. "From the moment I met you, I knew my life would never be the same. You brought a sense of peace and stability into my world that I never thought possible. You have shown me what it means to be truly selfless." She paused, taking a delicate, shaky breath. She squeezed my hands tighter. "I promise to stand by your side through every season of life. I promise to honor you, to protect you, and to cherish the life we are building together. For richer or for poorer in sickness and in health, as long as we both shall live." When she said the words "for richer or for poorer," the mask slipped. It was a microscopic shift, a fleeting muscular twitch that nobody else in the room could possibly have noticed. But I saw it. The corner of her mouth ticked upward. A tiny, arrogant, triumphant smirk flashed behind her tear-filled eyes. She was standing at the altar of our church, holding my hands privately, laughing at the fact that she fully intended to leave me entirely poorer before the month was over. She thought she had secured the victory. She thought she was holding all the cards. "It is your turn," Harrison the pastor said gently. I looked down at the woman who had tried to systematically destroy my financial existence. I did not feel angry anymore. I did not feel the crushing grief that had brought me to my knees in the parking garage. I felt powerful. I felt the absolute unshakable weight of the secret blind trust protecting my wealth and the heavy federal dossier currently sitting on an FBI agent desk. I took a slow, deep breath, letting the silence stretch just long enough to build the dramatic tension in the room. Chloe. I said, my voice projecting with a deep, resonant clarity that caused the guests in the back rows to lean forward. When I look at you, I see a future I never could have predicted. You and your family have taught me so much about the real world over these past few weeks. You have shown me exactly what happens when people are pushed to their limits, and you have taught me the true value of loyalty. I kept my eyes locked directly on hers. Her smile faltered for a fraction of a second, a tiny flicker of confusion crossing her face, but I pushed forward before she could analyze my words. I promise to give you everything you have earned. I continued, squeezing her hands with a firm, dominant grip. I promise to hold you completely accountable to the vows we make today. I promise that from this moment forward our lives will be defined by the absolute undeniable truth. I take you as my wife and I accept everything that comes with that title. I did not promise her my wealth. I did not promise to protect her. I promised her accountability and truth. The two things that were going to send her to a federal penitentiary. The pastor beamed, completely oblivious to the silent warfare happening right in front of him. He asked for the rings. The best man handed me a simple gold band, and the maid of honor handed Chloe a diamond-encrusted ring. We slid the cold metal bands onto each other's fingers. The weight of the gold felt like the heavy click of a vault door sliding permanently into place. By the power vested in me by the state and in the presence of God, and these witnesses, the pastor declared, raising his hands over us, I now pronounce you husband and wife. Harrison, you may kiss the bride. I leaned forward. Chloe tilted her head up, closing her eyes and parting her lips slightly. I pressed my mouth against hers. Her lips were soft, but the kiss was entirely clinical. It was the sealing of a contract. It was the closing of the trap. I pulled back after a respectable moment, keeping my polite, flawless smile firmly in place. The sanctuary erupted into thunderous applause. The organist struck the keys, filling the massive stone room with a joyful, booming melody. The guests stood up, clapping and cheering. In the front row, Barbara wiped a tear from her eye with a lace handkerchief, while Richard clapped his hands together, looking like a man who had just closed a highly profitable corporate merger. I took Chloe by the arm and turned to face the congregation. We began our walk back down the center aisle, stepping over the scattered white flower petals. The bright daylight from the open doors beckoned at the end of the church. People reached out from the pews to touch my arm, offering congratulations and well wishes. I nodded, thanking them, smiling until my jaw ached. We walked through the heavy wooden doors and out into the crisp, freezing winter air. A vintage black limousine was idling at the curb, ready to transport us to the elite country club where the reception was waiting. The photographer jogged backward in front of us, snapping rapid-fire pictures of the happy newlyweds stepping out into their new life. Chloe leaned her head against my shoulder as we reached the car, shivering slightly in the cold. "We did it. Harrison?" she whispered, her voice practically vibrating with suppressed excitement. "We are finally married." I opened the heavy door of the limousine for her. "Yes, we did," I replied, staring out over the roof of the car toward the downtown skyline. The legal threshold had been crossed. The spousal fraud was completely locked in. I watched her slide into the luxurious leather seat, totally unaware of the avalanche hanging over her head. It was done. Now it was time for the reception. The grand ballroom of the Oakmont Valley Country Club was a masterpiece of manufactured elegance. Hundreds of floating candles reflected off towering ice sculptures and gold-rimmed champagne flutes. A 12-piece jazz band played softly in the corner, providing the perfect soundtrack for a room full of people pretending to be richer, happier, and more important than they truly were. The air was thick with the scent of roasted duck, expensive perfumes, and the overwhelming floral aroma of imported white lilies. I sat at the center of the head table, the undisputed guest of honor at my own execution. To my left, Chloe was vibrating with a manic energy. She smiled at every passing guest. She laughed at every terrible joke. She played the radiant, overjoyed bride with a terrifying level of perfection. Across the room, Richard Sterling was holding court near the private bar. He was holding a glass of scotch and gesturing broadly, surrounded by local politicians and real estate developers. He looked like a king who had just conquered a new territory. He had successfully orchestrated the marriage. He had successfully forged the power of attorney. He had successfully moved $1.2 million of highly leveraged toxic debt into an offshore account. He thought he was untouchable. Todd was even worse. My new brother-in-law was currently leaning against a marble pillar, flirting aggressively with a bridesmaid while swigging from a bottle of expensive champagne. He kept shooting me these arrogant, knowing smirks across the dance floor. He was celebrating his own genius. He had managed to max out $85,000 in credit under my name fund, a lavish honeymoon for his sister, and funnel the rest into his failing brokerage firm through an untraceable crypto exchange. They were all drunk on their own perceived brilliance. The hours dragged on in a blur of clinking glasses and heavy, rich food. I ate my dinner mechanically. Every time a guest approached to congratulate us, I stood up, shook their hand, and offered a polite word of thanks. I kept my posture relaxed. I kept my breathing slow and measured. The sheer amount of adrenaline pumping through my system was enough to make my hands shake, but I forced my muscles into complete submission. I had spent 10 years working in financial compliance. I knew how to sit perfectly still while watching a criminal dig their own grave. The band suddenly stopped playing. A sharp, melodic chime echoed through the ballroom as the event coordinator tapped a silver spoon against a crystal glass. The low hum of conversation faded into an excited silence. "Ladies and gentlemen," the coordinator announced into a microphone, "if I could direct your attention to the center of the dance floor. It is time for the traditional cutting of the cake, followed immediately by the exchange of gifts between our beautiful bride and groom." A wave of applause swept through the room. Chloe grabbed my hand, her eyes sparkling with absolute delight. "Come on, Harrison," she whispered, pulling me out of my chair. "This is the best part." We walked to the center of the room. A towering 6-tier wedding cake stood on a silver pedestal covered in spun sugar flowers and edible gold leaf. The photographers circled us like a vulture, a heavy camera flashing relentlessly. Chloe wrapped both of her hands around the silver cake knife. I placed my hands gently over hers. We pushed the blade down through the soft layers of vanilla and buttercream. The crowd cheered. We fed each other a small piece of cake, smiling for the cameras. It was the perfect picture of domestic bliss. Then the event coordinator handed the microphone to Chloe. The room grew incredibly quiet. 300 guests leaned forward, eager to witness the intimate exchange of wedding gifts. Chloe cleared her throat. She looked at me, her face glowing with absolute adoration. "Harrison," she began, her voice echoing through the massive ballroom. "Before I met you, I did not know what true stability felt like. You came into my life and showed me what it means to be grounded. You are kind. You are patient. You have given me a sense of security that I will treasure for the rest of my life. I wanted to get you something that represents the time we are going to spend together. Something to remind you of this exact moment every single day." She gestured to Todd. He walked forward completely full of himself and handed her a sleek, heavy velvet box. Chloe took the box and pressed it into my hands. "Open it," she urged softly. I unlatched the velvet lid. Inside, resting on a bed of black silk, was an incredibly rare limited edition luxury watch. The polished silver casing gleamed under the chandelier lights. The intricate mechanical dial was a masterpiece of engineering. It was a beautiful, flawless timepiece. It also retailed for exactly $25,000. I knew exactly how she had paid for it. I knew exactly which fraudulently opened platinum credit card had been swiped to authorize the purchase. She was standing in front of 300 people, publicly presenting me with a symbol of her devotion bought entirely with my own stolen identity. The sheer psychopathic audacity of the gesture was almost impressive. "It is magnificent," I said, my voice perfectly steady. I lifted the heavy watch out of the box and strapped it around my left wrist. The cold metal settled against my skin. "Thank you, Chloe. I will wear it always." The guests clapped enthusiastically. Barbara wiped a manufactured tear from her eye. Richard nodded approvingly, no doubt thinking about how easy it had been to manipulate the boring compliance officer into funding his own wedding gift. The coordinator stepped forward to retrieve the microphone, but I held up my hand. I took the heavy metal microphone from Chloe. The cold weight of it grounded me. I turned to face the crowd. I looked out over the sea of wealthy faces, the glittering jewelry, the expensive suits. I found Richard standing near the front, his arms crossed over his chest. I found Todd leaning against a table, grinning like a fool. Then I turned my attention back to my new wife. Chloe has given me a beautiful gift. I started projecting my voice so it reached every corner of the massive room. And she is right. Marriage is about time. It is about the future we are building. But more than that, marriage is about honesty. It is about absolute, unfiltered transparency. I paused, letting the words hang in the air. The room was utterly silent. Everyone was hanging on my every word, expecting a romantic, emotional declaration of love. Over the past few weeks, I continued, my voice growing stronger, more resonant. I have learned so much about the Sterling family. You all welcomed me into your world. You showed me how you operate. You showed me your values. You showed me exactly what goes on behind closed doors when you think nobody is watching. Richard smiled proudly, nodding his head. He thought I was paying tribute to his business acumen. He thought I was bowing down to his superior intellect. A man learns a lot when he simply stays quiet and pays attention, I said, taking a slow step toward Chloe. I learned that trust is a very fragile thing. I learned that people are rarely who they pretend to be. But most importantly, I learned that in this life you eventually get exactly what you deserve. No more and no less. I reached into the inner breast pocket of my suit jacket. The fabric pulled tight as I withdrew a thick, heavy manila envelope. It was not wrapped in shiny paper. It did not have a silk bow. It was completely plain, sealed with a rigid metal clasp. "Chloe," I said, holding the envelope out to her. "You and your family have spent a lot of time planning for our future. You have drafted contracts. You have moved assets. You have gone to extraordinary lengths to ensure that your financial security is guaranteed. I wanted my gift to reflect that exact level of dedication." Chloe's eyes lit up. A bright, greedy spark flashed across her pupils. She reached out and took the envelope. I knew exactly what was running through her calculating mind. She thought I was handing her the official finalized deed to the $1.2 million estate. She thought I was handing her the ultimate victory. She pulled the metal clasp back. She reached inside and pulled out a thick stack of stapled heavy bond paper. The silence in the grand ballroom was absolute. 300 people watched the bride receive her gift. Chloe looked down at the first page. I watched her eyes track across the bold black text printed at the top of the document. United States District Court, Eastern District. Grand Jury Indictment. It took her brain a few seconds to process the legal terminology. She blinked her brow, furrowing in confusion. She read the next few lines. She saw her father name. She saw her brother name. She saw the specific, irrefutable federal charges: wire fraud, aggravated identity theft, conspiracy to commit financial fraud. The physical transformation was instantaneous and terrifying. The bright, radiant flush of the happy bride completely vanished. All the blood drained from her face, leaving her skin a sickening, chalky white. Her breath caught in her throat, producing a sharp, ragged, gasping sound. Her hands began to tremble so violently that the thick stack of paper rattled in her grip. "Harrison," she choked out, her voice barely a whisper. Her eyes darted up to meet mine, wide with a sudden, absolute terror. "What is this?" "This is exactly what you deserve, Chloe," I replied, my voice stripped of all emotion, cold and hollow as a concrete cell. "You wanted to bleed me dry. He wanted to take my life savings and walk away. Did you really think a senior financial compliance officer would not check his own banking logs? Did you really think I would not notice a forged signature on an offshore wire transfer? The microphone caught every single word. My voice echoed off the walls. A collective shockwave rippled through the guests. People gasped. Whispers erupted across the room like a sudden fire. Richard pushed his way to the front of the crowd, his face purple with sudden explosive rage. "What the hell is going on here?" he roared, marching toward the dance floor. "What is in that envelope, Harrison? What kind of sick joke are you playing?" Todd was right behind him, dropping his champagne glass on a table. The glass shattered to the sound, cutting through the rising panic. Todd charged forward, his fists clenched, ready to physically intimidate me just like he had on the patio the night before. "It is not a joke, Richard," I said, dropping the microphone onto the floor. It hit the hardwood with a loud, heavy thud. "It is a 40-page federal indictment. Your offshore account at the Bank of Avalon has been frozen. Todd crypto wallets have been seized. The power of attorney you forged was legally voided the moment I signed it. You stole money from a federal investigator acting as an informant." Richard stopped dead in his tracks. The arrogance, the power, the untouchable aura of the sterling patriarch shattered into a million pieces. His jaw went slack. He looked at Todd, who had suddenly turned the color of ash. They realized in that exact moment that the peasant they had mocked, the boring desk worker they had systematically tried to destroy, had just orchestrated their total annihilation. Before Richard could formulate a lie, before Todd could take another aggressive step toward me, a loud, heavy crash echoed from the back of the room. The massive, ornate mahogany doors of the grand ballroom swung open with violent, terrifying force. The thick wood slammed against the walls. The jazz band froze. The guests spun around in panic. A dozen men and women dressed in dark tactical windbreakers strode into the opulent room. They moved with a rigid, highly coordinated precision that completely destroyed the elegant atmosphere of the wedding reception. The bright yellow letters printed across their backs stood out clearly against the dim, romantic lighting. FBI. Agent Miller walked at the front of the formation. His badge hung clearly from his belt. His face was completely stern. He did not care about the floating candles. He did not care about the ice sculptures or the wealthy politicians standing in the crowd. He marched straight down the center aisle, directly toward the wedding cake, directly toward the family that had built an empire on lies. "Richard Sterling," Agent Miller announced, his voice booming with absolute federal authority. "Todd Sterling, Chloe Sterling, you are all under arrest for conspiracy to commit wire fraud and federal identity theft. Step away from the table and keep your hands where I can see them." The ballroom descended into absolute chaos. Women screamed. Guests scrambled backward, knocking over chairs and spilling expensive wine across the polished floor. The illusion of the Sterling family was dead, replaced by the harsh, brutal reality of handcuffs and federal agents. I stood calmly at the center of the storm, watching the woman who tried to ruin my life drop her beautiful wedding bouquet to the floor. The heavy mahogany doors of the grand ballroom swung open with a violent, terrifying force. The thick wood slammed against the floral-decorated walls, producing a sound like a thunderclap that echoed across the massive room. The 12-piece jazz band froze instantly. A single trumpet player let out a sharp, discordant squeak before lowering his instrument in shock. The hundreds of wealthy guests spun around, dropping their expensive crystal champagne flutes and silver forks in absolute panic. A dozen men and women, dressed in dark tactical windbreakers, marched into the opulent dining room. They moved in perfect synchronized formation. Their heavy boots stomped against the polished hardwood floor, completely destroying the elegant romantic atmosphere Barbara Sterling had spent hundreds of thousands of dollars to create. The bright yellow letters printed boldly across the back of their jackets stood out clearly in the dim golden lighting. Federal Bureau of Investigation. Agent Miller walked at the front of the tactical formation. His suit was dark and functional. His face was set in a mask of pure, unyielding federal authority. He did not care about the floating candles. He did not care about the towering ice sculptures or the elite local politicians staring at him with their mouths hanging open. He walked directly down the center aisle past the towering six-tier wedding cake and stopped right in front of the Sterling family. Richard Sterling tried to rally his crumbling dignity. He puffed out his chest, attempting to project the dominant alpha male persona he used to intimidate his corporate rivals. He stepped toward Agent Miller, waving a dismissive hand, as if the federal agents were nothing more than unruly country club employees who had forgotten their place. "Do you have any idea who I am?" Richard demanded, his face flushing a deep shade of crimson. "I am a major contributor to the mayoral campaign in this city. I golf with the district attorney every single weekend. You are making a catastrophic mistake interrupting my daughter's wedding reception. I will have your badge sitting on my desk by tomorrow morning." Agent Miller did not flinch. He did not even blink. He reached into his dark jacket pocket and pulled out a thick stack of folded legal warrants. He unrolled the papers and read the charges in a loud, flat voice that carried perfectly over the terrified silence of the ballroom. "Richard Sterling, you are being detained on federal charges of conspiracy to commit financial fraud, international money laundering, and bank fraud," Agent Miller announced. "Put your hands behind your back immediately." The sheer absolute finality of the statement broke the spell in the room. Two federal agents stepped forward, grabbing Richard by his custom-tailored suit sleeves. They forced his arms behind his back. The sharp metallic click of the steel handcuffs snapping shut sounded like a gunshot. The politicians Richard had invited, the elite men he had spent the entire evening trying to impress, physically recoiled. They took large steps backward, actively distancing themselves from the toxic radioactive fallout. Social death was instantaneous. In a matter of seconds, Richard went from a respected, wealthy patriarch to a handcuffed federal criminal. Todd Sterling tried a completely different approach. My arrogant brother-in-law realized the magnitude of the situation and immediately chose cowardice. He turned on his heel and tried to sprint toward the kitchen service doors located behind the private bar. In his blind panic, he crashed into a tall cocktail table, knocking over a massive pyramid of expensive champagne glasses. The crystal shattered loudly, sending a spray of sticky alcohol and broken glass everywhere. But the FBI had already secured the perimeter of the ballroom. Two broad-shouldered agents tackled Todd to the hardwood floor before he could even reach the swinging kitchen doors. They pinned his arms down, pressing his face directly into the spilled champagne and shattered crystal. Todd Sterling, an agent, shouted over the commotion, "You are under arrest for aggravated identity theft and domestic wire fraud. Do not resist." Todd thrashed against the floor, his expensive designer tuxedo soaking up the alcohol. He looked absolutely pathetic. He was stripped of all his fake bravado, crying out for his father to do something to save him. But Richard was already being marched toward the main exit, his head bowed in total, utter humiliation. Barbara stood frozen near the wedding cake, clutching her heavy diamond necklace and gasping for air as her entire fake empire collapsed into dust before her eyes. And then there was Chloe. The woman I had married less than 3 hours ago was standing completely paralyzed in her stunning white silk gown. The 40-page federal indictment I had handed her as my wedding gift was now scattered across the floor at her feet. She stared at her father being led away in handcuffs. She looked at her brother sobbing helplessly on the floor. For 3 long years, I had believed this family was a tight-knit unit. I had believed they were fiercely loyal to one another, even in their calculated cruelty toward me. I was completely wrong. When predators are finally backed into a corner, they do not protect their pack. They turn on each other to survive the trap. Chloe suddenly snapped out of her paralyzed state. The overwhelming panic completely consumed her mind. The sweet, devout, blushing bride vanished forever, replaced by a desperate, cornered animal willing to do anything to escape the cage. She lunged forward, grabbing Agent Miller tightly by the arm. Her flawless wedding makeup was beginning to run down her face, mixing with her frantic tears. "Wait!" Chloe screamed, her voice cracking with pure, raw hysteria. "You cannot arrest me. I did not do anything wrong. It was all my father." Richard planned the entire thing from the very beginning. He told Todd to open the credit cards using the Social Security number. He told me to drain the wedding accounts and wire the cash. I just did exactly what they told me to do. Please, you have to believe me. They forced me into this scheme. She was throwing her own flesh and blood to the wolves without a single second of hesitation. She was loudly confessing to her role in federal crimes in a room filled with 300 witnesses just to save her own skin. I stood a few feet away watching the ultimate betrayal unfold with clinical detachment. She had promised to honor and protect me at the church altar while secretly planning to destroy me. Now, facing the brutal consequences of her actions, she was actively destroying the very people who had taught her how to be so ruthless. Agent Miller gently but firmly removed her frantic hands from his jacket. "Save the confessions for the federal interrogation room, Miss Sterling," he said flatly, pulling out another pair of steel handcuffs. "Or I suppose it is Mrs. Cole now. Either way, you are coming with us." An agent stepped forward and secured her wrists behind her back, being careful not to tangle the metal chains in her expensive vintage lace sleeves. Chloe turned her head and looked directly at me. Her eyes were wide and frantic. She was begging for a rescue she knew deep down I would never provide. "Harrison," she sobbed, tears streaming freely down her pale cheeks. "Harrison, please do something. You have to tell them this is a mistake. Tell them I am a good person. Tell them I love you. We are married. We are husband and wife in the eyes of God. You have to protect me. I never wanted to hurt you." The entire ballroom watched us in stunned silence. The background music was gone. The clinking glasses were completely silent. The only sounds were the heavy breathing of the shocked guests and the soft, pathetic sobbing of my new bride. She expected me to feel pity. She expected the quiet, boring compliance officer to break down under the pressure and rush to her heroic defense. I walked slowly across the wooden dance floor. I stopped just inches away from her trembling body. I looked down into her tear-filled eyes. I did not raise my voice. I did not gloat. I did not show a single ounce of anger or vindictive joy. I felt nothing but a clean, empty, hollow space inside my chest where my love for her used to live. I leaned in close, keeping my voice low and perfectly calm, ensuring my final words were meant only for her ears. "I can barely stand his cheap suits, Mom," I whispered. Chloe stopped crying instantly. Her breath caught sharply in her throat. Her eyes widened in absolute sheer horror as her brain finally processed exactly what I was saying. She realized in that terrifying moment that I had heard every single word spoken in that dark coat room. She realized this entire wedding, this entire lavish reception had been a meticulously engineered trap designed by me. But once the wedding is over and his name is on the joint trust, I continued quoting her own venomous words back to her with chilling surgical accuracy. "I will bleed him dry and walk away. He is too much of a trusting, naive loser to ever see it coming." I stood up straight, adjusting the cuffs of my navy suit. I looked at her one last time, offering her the exact same blank, polite smile I had given her for the past 3 weeks of our engagement. "You played your part perfectly, Chloe," I said softly. "And now I am playing mine. I am bleeding you dry and I am walking away." I turned my back on her. I did not wait to hear her response. I did not look at Richard or Todd or Barbara as the federal agents marched them toward the exit. I walked straight through the crowd of stunned, silent guests. The wealthy elite members of society parted like the Red Sea, stepping out of my way as I moved toward the massive mahogany doors. I walked out of the grand ballroom, down the carpeted hallway, and pushed through the front entrance of the exclusive country club. The freezing winter air hit my face, feeling incredibly clean and sharp. I took a deep breath, filling my lungs with the cold night sky. The heavy, crushing weight I had carried for 21 days was completely gone. I handed my ticket to the valet, who was staring in shock at the police cruisers flashing their red and blue lights near the entrance. I got into my modest sedan, started the engine, and drove away from the burning wreckage of the Sterling family. The collapse of their fake empire did not end that night. The dramatic public arrests were merely the initial spark that ignited the financial powder keg I had carefully constructed. The real, total destruction happened over the following weeks, executed entirely through the cold, merciless machinery of the legal and financial systems they thought they controlled. Because of my meticulous legal preparation with Samuel Keaton, The predatory prenuptial agreement they had forced me to sign became the very instrument of their absolute ruin. Chloe had immediately triggered the infidelity and forfeiture clauses the moment she was arrested frantically trying to claim the joint trust to pay for her criminal defense attorneys. But the trap functioned exactly as Samuel and I had designed it. My actual life savings were safely secured in the irrevocable blind trust. It was completely untouchable and legally predated, the marriage making it entirely immune to their claims. The joint trust the account Chloe fought so aggressively to seize contained absolutely nothing but the massive toxic debts Todd had fraudulently acquired in my name. By legally claiming ownership of the joint marital assets through the prenuptial agreement, Chloe legally assumed full financial liability for all $85,000 of unsecured credit card debt. She effectively stole her own family debts. The federal government moved swiftly and ruthlessly. Agent Miller and his forensic team used the exact bank routing numbers I provided to track Richard offshore accounts in the Cayman Islands. Because the money was tied directly to domestic wire fraud, the international banking authorities complied with the federal injunction without hesitation. The offshore accounts were frozen immediately. The $1.2 million they had siphoned away was seized by the government pending a massive federal criminal trial. With their offshore cash permanently locked down and their domestic credit completely destroyed by the fraud indictments, the Sterlings had absolutely no liquidity left to survive. The grand facade shattered instantly. The exclusive Oakmont Valley Country Club revoked their membership the very next morning, sending a public notice of their expulsion due to criminal conduct. The local politicians and elite socialites who had attended the wedding completely disavowed them, blocking their numbers and issuing public statements expressing their profound shock and dismay. The Sterlings became social ghosts overnight, entirely shunned by the world they worshipped. Without the stolen funds to cover his massive outstanding bridge loans, Richard real estate brokerage collapsed within 14 days. His angry creditors descended like a flock of starving vultures. The domestic banks moved aggressively to recover their mounting losses. Less than a month after I handed Chloe the federal indictment at our wedding reception, a bright red foreclosure notice was hammered into the heavy wooden front door of the Sterling family luxury mansion. The bank seized the massive property, forcing Barbara to pack whatever designer clothes she could fit into a single suitcase before the security team changed the locks. Todd remained in federal custody, denied bail due to his severe status as a high-flight risk. Richard faced a towering mountain of corporate embezzlement charges that practically guaranteed he would spend the rest of his natural life behind bars wearing a bright orange jumpsuit. And Chloe, the beautiful woman who had meticulously planned to leave me with a broken heart and an empty bank account, was left completely alone. She was facing multiple felony charges and a mountain of toxic financial debt she could never hope to repay in her lifetime. They had built an entire world on deception, arrogance, and pure greed. They truly believed they were the apex predators, manipulating the weak and the trusting for their own selfish gain. But they forgot the golden rule of financial compliance. The numbers never lie, and the undeniable truth always balances the ledger in the end. 6 months have passed since the heavy mahogany doors of the grand ballroom slammed shut on the Sterling family illusion. The transition from the blinding chaos of federal sirens to the profound quiet of my current life feels like waking up from a decade-long fever dream. The legal machinery of the United States government operates with a slow, crushing certainty. Once the federal indictments were unsealed and the evidence was laid bare upon the prosecutor desk, the pristine high society facade they had spent their entire lives maintaining evaporated into thin air. The marriage itself was erased as if it never existed, because the union was predicated entirely on a documented criminal conspiracy to commit wire fraud and extort premarital assets. The family court judge granted my petition for a civil annulment within a matter of weeks. I did not have to fight over shared property. I did not have to negotiate alimony or endure messy mediation sessions with hostile attorneys. The marriage certificate we signed at the church altar was completely invalidated. It was reduced to a piece of state evidence rather than a binding legal covenant. I walked out of the courthouse that day feeling an immense physical weight lift from my shoulders. Todd and Richard did not possess the brilliant criminal minds they thought they did. When federal investigators laid out the digital paper trail I had handed them tracking the offshore routing numbers, the forged power of attorney, and the cryptocurrency laundering logs, their high-priced defense attorneys advised them to surrender immediately. Richard is currently serving a 72-month sentence in a minimum security federal penitentiary. Todd received 4 years for aggravated identity theft. The arrogant country club patriarchs and slick real estate brokers who used to dominate luxury steakhouses are now wearing standard-issue khaki jumpsuits. Barbara Sterling was not federally indicted, but her punishment was arguably much worse for a woman of her supreme vanity. Stripped of the foreclosed mansion and her frozen bank accounts, she was forced to move into a tiny 2-bedroom apartment on the industrial outskirts of the city. She is completely exiled from the elite circles she once ruled with an iron fist. The wealthy women she used to impress will not even acknowledge her presence in a grocery store aisle. The social death she experienced was absolute. And then there is Chloe, the beautiful woman who stood in a dark coat room and confidently declared that I was a naive, trusting loser she could bleed dry. Because she fully cooperated with the federal authorities and testified against her father and brother to save herself, she managed to avoid a lengthy prison sentence. But the prosecution did not let her walk away unscathed. She accepted a brutal plea deal. Along with 5 years of strict federal probation, the judge ordered her to pay massive financial restitution to the domestic banks she had defrauded. The offshore funds were seized by the government, but the toxic credit card debt she legally assumed through our joint trust remains entirely her burden. To meet the monthly restitution payments mandated by the court, Chloe was forced to take the only employment she could find as a convicted felon. I saw her once completely by accident about a month ago. I had stopped at a generic chain coffee shop near the financial district to grab a dark roast before a morning meeting with Samuel Keaton. I stood in the short line looking at the menu board. When I stepped up to the counter, I looked at the cashier taking my order. It was Chloe. She was wearing a stiff polyester uniform shirt stained with espresso syrup. Her hair was pulled back into a messy, practical ponytail. The expensive designer perfumes and flawless makeup were completely gone, replaced by the dark circles of chronic exhaustion and minimum wage stress. When she looked up and saw my face, the digital barcode scanner slipped out of her hand and clattered against the linoleum floor. We stood there separated by a plastic cash register. She did not say a single word. I did not say a word. I simply looked at the woman who had meticulously tried to destroy my life. She looked incredibly small, utterly defeated and trapped in a financial prison of her own making. I paid for my coffee, left a generous tip in the glass jar, and walked out the door without looking back. There was no joy in seeing her like that. There was no vindictive thrill rushing through my veins. There was only a profound sense of closure. She was exactly where she put herself. The contrast between her reality and mine is striking. My life savings, the money I had worked so incredibly hard to accumulate over 10 years of strict financial discipline, remained completely untouched. The irrevocable blind trust Samuel had established for me acted like an impenetrable fortress. Because the funds were secured before the fraudulent marriage ever took place, the federal seizure of the Sterling assets did not impact a single penny of my actual net worth. The $45,000 they initially stole was eventually returned to me by the bank fraud department, bringing my portfolio completely whole. My career also thrived. The senior partners at my compliance firm were absolutely stunned by the meticulous nature of my private investigation. They did not fire me for using company software. Instead, they promoted me to a regional director position, recognizing that a man who can systematically dismantle a multi-million-dollar fraud ring while smiling through a wedding rehearsal is exactly the kind of man they want leading their risk management division. Today, the sky above my head is a brilliant crystal-clear blue. I am standing in the exact center of a sprawling 2-acre plot of land, located just outside the city limits. The air here smells like pine needles and fresh, damp soil, a complete departure from the suffocating floral arrangements and expensive cologne of the country club. I bought this land outright 3 weeks ago, using a portion of the clean, untouched cash from my protected trust. There are no nosy neighbors watching me from a manicured golf course. There are no local politicians to impress. There is just open space, a quiet stream running along the southern border, and the solid, unshakable ground beneath my boots. I am looking at the wooden stakes driven into the dirt, connected by bright orange string outlining the foundation of my future home. It will not be a $1.2 million estate with marble columns and sweeping grand staircases. It will be a beautifully crafted custom home, built with rich natural wood massive windows to let in the morning sunlight, and a wide wraparound porch where I can drink my coffee in absolute peace. I am hiring local contractors to pour the concrete next week. Every single brick, every wooden beam, every nail driven into this property will be paid for honestly. There will be no predatory bridge loans. There will be no shell companies hiding toxic assets. There will be no hidden leverage waiting to collapse. It is a home built on the unshakable foundation of truth and transparency. As I walk along the perimeter of the property, listening to the dry winter grass crunch beneath my feet, I think about the entire agonizing journey that brought me to this exact coordinate. I think about the years I spent believing I was somehow inferior because I did not wear luxury European brands or drive leased sports cars. I think about how incredibly easy it is to be manipulated by people who project supreme confidence while secretly drowning in their own deceit. The Sterlings had mastered the art of the grand facade. They used social intimidation and brutal condescension to mask their overwhelming insecurity. They truly believed that because I was quiet, because I was polite, because I preferred a simple, honest life, I was a weak target. They confused basic human decency with extreme gullibility. People like the Sterlings measure a man worth by the label on his suit and the volume of his bragging. They thought my silence was stupidity. But true strength does not need to shout. The loudest people in the room are usually standing on hollow ground, and all it takes is a little patience to watch them fall through it. They spend their entire lives building paper castles, convinced that the sheer size of their illusions will protect them from harsh reality. They mistake loud aggression for actual power and relentless greed for genuine ambition. When you live your life constantly looking down on the people around you, you never realize that the foundation beneath your own feet is slowly turning to dust. I learned that human dignity is not something anyone else can grant you. Barbara Sterling told me I was lucky that her family was elevating me to their level. But the absolute truth is that true elevation comes entirely from within. It comes from knowing exactly who you are when the bank accounts are frozen and the audience has gone home. I kept my dignity in the dark church coat room when my heart was breaking. I kept my dignity when Todd threatened my relationship on the freezing country club patio. I kept my dignity standing at the church altar, looking directly into the eyes of a woman who was actively trying to ruin me. I did not compromise my core values to match their corruption. I used my intelligence, my infinite patience, and the unbreakable weight of federal law to defend myself. I walked calmly through the fire they set for me, and I emerged completely unscathed. The water stain shaped like Texas on the ceiling of my old rented duplex is just a distant memory now. The long, agonizing nights spent staring at my laptop, analyzing fraudulent offshore wire transfers, feel like a lifetime ago. The silence I enjoy today is not the silence of a victim afraid to speak up against his abusers. It is the deep, restful silence of a man who has fought a quiet war and reclaimed his entire life. I look out over the empty plot of land, feeling the crisp winter breeze brush against my face. The world feels wide open. The future belongs entirely to me. I have learned the hardest lesson a man can learn about false trust and intimate betrayal, but I did not let the toxic experience turn my heart to stone. I am simply wiser, much stronger and fiercely protective of the profound peace I have finally earned. If you have ever been underestimated by people who thought they were better than you, drop a comment below and share how you proved them wrong. Do not forget to like and subscribe for more stories about why you should never mistake quietness for weakness.